around 15 years ago, while I was still in high school. Boy, that is a sobering introductory statement. I am elderly, and I don't know when that happened. About 15 years ago, when I was in high school, I didn't have too many close friends. There are people from this period of time who I loved and continue to love, but I only meaningfully engaged with most of these people after becoming an adult. This was except for one man. I had him clocked as a bit of an oddball. He didn't even go to my school, and he wore a pair of very bright pants one time. I felt that said something about him, but I didn't know what. Anyway, we connected. This fellow by the name of Tristan would go on to become one of my very best friends. In the years following high school, we would hang out almost every day. We watched the same shows and played the same games. We went through an obligatory Pink Floyd phase together.
You doing drugs?
We got an apartment and became roomies, lots of shared experiences. Time has passed since those days, and to have seen my pal go from the type of guy who'd probably show up to a job interview wearing pajama pants to a devoted father and husband has been a bittersweet privilege. Sometimes I wish I could go back to those days where we'd spend an entire weekend playing Time Splitters 2, listening to Mastodon, and going for breakfast at 1 in the afternoon. But take it from an old man, such an existence is sweetest rose-tinted. Our lives have changed, demanding different things from us, but underneath it all, we are still the same people, and that's reassuring. So, Dark Cloud is a dungeon crawler developed by Level 5. I'm kidding. I have a segue. Tristan loves Dark Cloud. His love of the game comes through with such an unyielding force that I'd almost consider it to be one of his personality traits. If, God forbid, his mind ever declines from dementia, I'm sorry to say it, but the names of his family members and friends are going way before anything related to Dark Cloud is. It's a beloved childhood classic to him, the way Final Fantasy VII or Ocarina of Time are to many of us. But it's not just localized to childhood. He's been telling me to play Dark Cloud since the day I met him, and he still does regularly. In fact, the last time he mentioned it was about 2 months ago as of the writing of this, which is a pretty long time. I'm expecting to get a Dark Cloud mention soon. I have had to hear him sing the virtues of Dark Cloud for 15 years, and he's had to listen to my half-hearted commitments for just as long. Yeah, I've been meaning to get around to it, man. Oh, it's on my list. It just keeps slipping my mind. Now, I'm a 180-year-old man. My time on this planet is limited. I can't keep acting in childish ways or making promises that I don't intend to keep. I also feel a profound sense of gratitude for having had an archetypal bro at such a formative time in my life, and it's time to pay that back with the worst gift anyone could ever ask for. A multi-hour long video about an ancient PlayStation 2 game series. In all honesty, I have been planning this video since I first started this channel. This is, for me, a 15-year-old promise fulfilled. This is my Odyssey through Dark Cloud, and what an Odyssey it will be. Level 5 is quite a well-respected game development studio with a prolific output, but the name Level 5 isn't thrown around too often outside of a nostalgic JRPG niche. Level 5 has developed many well-loved games, like the Professor Layton series, the Ni no Kuni games, and Dragon Quest VIII, which remains the PlayStation 2's highest-selling game in Japan, full stop. Their relationship with the PS2 predated the console itself. The company was established by veteran game developer Akihiro Hino, whose interest in making games began when he was in 3rd grade. He was flipping through the pages of a video game magazine when he came across an article about an RPG called Wizardry. In Wizardry, the player could create a party of dungeon delvers to their own specifications, from their race and class to their morality alignment. In a world dominated by simple score-based arcade games, he was floored by this degree of player choice. He socked away money for years and bought himself a computer, but instead of filling it up with games, he learned how to make them instead. By the time the Famicom released, he didn't have much interest in console games. The home computer, he felt, was the future. That is, until he played Dragon Quest III. The game featured a prototypical open world, a deep character class system, and an engaging plot. The game was a leap forward in terms of JRPG storytelling, and it was hugely influential to Hino. At 21 years old, he was hired by the developer Riverhill Soft. Here he would spend years as a programmer before finally landing a directorial role on the sequel to a game called Overblood. Hino wasn't satisfied with sitting around and taking orders from the higher-ups, So following the sequel's release, Hino broke off from Riverhill Soft, forming his own company, Level 5. The name reflected the highest possible score a student could achieve on their report card in Japan. With him, 9 employees from Riverhill Soft followed, clearly confident in his vision as a designer and a businessman. With the PlayStation 2 on the horizon, Sony Computer Entertainment proposed a contract. The two companies would become close partners, with Level 5 having access to Sony's resources. In return, the developer would produce a launch title for the PS2. The two parties agreed, and Dark Cloud was born. Within 6 months, Level 5 had produced a prototype of their upcoming RPG. This demo mainly showcased the game engine's impressive graphics, but also some of its basic gameplay systems. The realistic cloth physics and water reflection effects were superb for their time. Sony would show the game off at various conventions, like the Tokyo Game Show, in order to build hype and prove what its upcoming system would be capable of. One of the earliest features advertised was the game's diorama system, allowing players to build and explore their own RPG towns. Early previews were very positive, with journalists drawing comparisons to games like Ocarina of Time, Populous, and Shenmue, kind of a strange combination. It was an action RPG, a dungeon crawler, and a city builder all in one. Eventually, the game would release in Japan on December 14th of 2000. Unfortunately, this meant that Dark Cloud missed the PS2's launch by about 9 months. It was still a very early game for the console, but it wouldn't benefit from that launch window hype. Reviews in Japan were moderately positive, but the game sold terribly, moving less than 20,000 units in its release week. About 6 months later, in May of 2001, the game was brought to North America. This version included more enemies, more weapons, more items, and plenty of other additions. It received solid critical praise and enjoyed greater sales than in Japan by orders of magnitude. Thanks to its reception in North America, Dark Cloud's status as a cult hit was cemented. But how does the game hold up? I hope it's great, or I'm about to break a man's heart. The game is presented as a folktale coming to life from the pages of a storybook. It sets a nice cozy tone with a pre-rendered background and a pleasant little music box tune. Then we're immediately dropped into the intro with a group of cult dancers and a creepy synthesized choir playing in the background. It's a classic comfy sabotage bait and switch, and I'm not happy about it. We follow a military man joined by a dark priest. The two men are conducting a ritual in order to awaken an ancient evil, the Dark Genie, whose power will be used for surely bad things. Let me crack open the game manual. I want to see what this guy's name is. Flag Gilgister? Flag. What's our character's name? Sock? Flag is a colonel in the military of some far-off eastern country and seeks to annihilate the people of the western continent. This introduction succeeds in creating a fun yet spooky mood. The baked lighting coming from those ethereal torches sets the tone, and that uncanny motion capture dancing is unsettling. Okay, stop. That you can't dance like that. Stop dancing like that. This is supposed to be unsettling. You're making it funny. The adorable Dark Genie is released from a massive urn, hungry after being imprisoned for 400 years. So he just devours the priest, which is unexpected, but probably doesn't bode well. Meanwhile, we join our protagonist, Toen, in his home village of No-Rune. The village is celebrating its Star Festival, where a dance of life takes place in contrast to the cultist dance of death. Just look at this life-giving dancing. I predict a bountiful harvest. Anytime you got a happy village in the introduction, tragedy is sure to follow. Gilgister and the genie arrive in No-Rune, silhouetted by the twin moons of Terra. The genie, forced to accept the colonel as his master, begins wreaking havoc on No-Rune, then the remainder of the continent. The genie has seemingly destroyed the cities of Western Terra and killed most of its people. Seemingly. Toen awakens from unconsciousness to find himself face to face with a mysterious entity known only as the Fairy King, who explains the predicament to Toen. The Fairy King was unable to defeat or stop the genie, but he was able to seal the buildings and the people of the continent in protective spheres called Atla. The force of the genie's magical blasts then scattered those spheres far and wide. I love the way these animated cutscenes look, by the way, they're so silly. Toen is granted a magical stone called the Atlamilia, which will allow him to unseal the Atla. Acting as an avatar of sorts for the Fairy King, he's tasked with finding the Atla, rebuilding this destroyed world, and stopping the genie's evil plans. And here Dark Cloud begins. It's a narratively simple introduction to be sure, but I can dig it. Again, we're reading from the pages of a child's fairy tale. Keeping to this kind of simplicity is to be expected. Simplicity doesn't mean that nothing interesting can be done with the game's plot. It's compelling enough to give us a reason to go places and do things. Where are those places? What are those things? We'll find out. Someday. Later that day, I went down into Divine Beast Cave to find the Atla in order to rebuild the town. Now, the central gameplay loop of Dark Cloud is actually about as dead simple as an RPG can be. You head into a dungeon, you find Atla on each floor with people or houses in them, and then eventually you come out and piece together the settlement you're currently in. The devil is in the details with Dark Cloud, and that definitely starts with the dungeon crawling. The dungeon floors in Dark Cloud are procedurally generated. This means that each time you arrive on a floor, even if it's one you've visited before, the game slots in a number of prefab rooms and hallways together to create a semi-random layout. The locations of the Atla, treasure chests, and enemies on the floor are always going to be different. This style of dungeon crawling was established with the 1980s PC game Rogue, and then later popularized by Blizzard's Diablo series, but this kind of design did have a foothold in Japanese games as well. Namco's incredibly influential Tower of Druaga utilized randomly generated floors. Later console games like Konami's Azure Dreams would take a crack at random maps too. While this tradition certainly did exist, Japanese RPGs typically would feature handmade maps. This meant that Dark Cloud's procedurally generated dungeons were a relatively novel feature even at the time. In the dungeons you'll find enemies, loot, Atla, and a few other odds and ends we'll talk about later. We'll start with the enemies and thus the combat here. Combat, like many other aspects of Dark Cloud, is deceptively simple. You can lock onto enemies using the circle button and slash away at them by tapping X repeatedly. By successfully connecting 4 slashes in a row, the final slash will be a more powerful one. This incentivizes you to plan your attacks in advance and carefully consider enemy movement. This means you have to consider the speed gauge. I think stamina would probably be more appropriate, but hey, when in Rome. You call it speed. Simply put, the speed weed gauge decreases when you swing your weapon. If it's at 0, you can attack, but it won't evolve into a combo. There's a surprisingly long list of enemies in Dark Cloud with many novel behaviors to keep you on your toes. Skeletons, for instance, will march up to you saying, "Hey, Busta, what's the big idea?" and then fake you out by jumping backwards. They can also raise their shields to defend themselves, rendering your attacks useless. It's pretty annoying. Many enemies, like bats, float through the air, forcing you to hold the X button to use a charged jump attack to reach them. Dashers dash, so you have to smoke them while they're cruising by you or otherwise avoid their attacks. These are just a few examples. With each new area, you'll encounter new enemies. New enemies often exhibit new behavior, so there's always a bit of a testing period as you try to bait out attacks and see what makes them tick. Taste steel. Collecting and managing loot is a significant part of Dark Cloud's gameplay. Of course, you can find consumable items, weapons, things like that. There isn't really a magic system in Dark Cloud, but you can find throwable objects with elements attached to them. There's an item you can find called Dran's Feather, which allows you to run when it's placed in an active slot. I consider this item to be necessary, given how slowly the game can move otherwise. On each floor of a dungeon, you can also find a map for that particular floor, as well as a magic gem which shows the locations of chests and enemies. Why is this important? Well, there are a number of reasons. First of all, if you want to evacuate the dungeon, you have to kill all enemies on the floor. That is, unless you have an item called Escape Powder. This can be consumed to immediately get out of a dungeon, but typically all enemies have to be defeated. Second of all, in order to advance to the next floor, you need a key item to unlock that passageway. These key items randomly drop from enemies. Sometimes you'll find it on the first enemy you kill, sometimes you'll find it on the very last one. No matter how much it feels like the system is rigged against you and the developers are deliberately placing the key on the last enemy to drive you insane, it is purely a matter of chance, so I am told. There are also keys that unlock doors in the dungeon. These can either be dropped from enemies or found in treasure chests. They're not always necessary. Sometimes they'll lead to more loot, sometimes they'll lead to nothing, literally nothing, the joys of procedural generation. But sometimes those locked doors will gate progress to the next level. In any case, it's usually a good idea to clear the entire area of enemies and open every chest, which are often enemies, very, very often, surprisingly often enemies. Sometimes a clown will pop out of a chest who gives you your choice of random items. Hi, is everybody happy? Well, first of all, no, and second of all, is that a question or a statement? I'm sorry, but no game will ever execute this concept with as much panache as the Boxer Bros from Chrono Cross. It just can't be done. Finally, there's the Atla. These spheres are located in each dungeon. Upon opening them, you'll find one particular building, object, or person from the settlement you're operating within. I'll be damned, dreams do come true. Rebuilding the village is a pretty major part of Dark Cloud. No Rune Village has seen better days. There are no townspeople, no shops, just Towan. And for some reason the mayor's house was totally unscathed. I find that suspicious. You can freely wander around the big crater where your village used to be, but you can also enter edit mode where the Atla contents can be placed. This is called the Georama. It works like this: you find buildings inside of balls, and you place those buildings however you want to, within reason. You can rotate and plop various townspeople's houses and businesses down on a free space in the map. The map is grid-based, and you can only rotate in 4 directions, so there's not exactly a lot of freedom in how you want to place things. You can also find trees, rivers, and other little adornments to help give the village some life. Of course, there's nothing comfy about living in a ghost town, so you'll also need to fill those buildings up with their inhabitants and various objects. As you fill the town up with buildings and townspeople, things become a little livelier. NPCs wander around and are available to be talked with. You can gain access to fishing ponds, and stores will open up. The town building stuff is fun enough. It brings to mind the game ActRaiser on the Super Nintendo. Half of that game is an action platformer, while the other half is a god game, city builder type thing. That part of the game is quite simple and not as deep as first impressions might have you believe, but it's a fun addition. Dark Cloud kind of feels the same. You might think that the Georama is a really intricate and modifiable system, but it's actually very simple. The towns typically exist on square horizontal planes. This leads to very simplistic level design, and an overall deficit in nooks and crannies to explore. Placing rivers, for instance, feels kinda awkward. These are really geometrically basic segments and can only connect to themselves, not bodies of water or anything like that. Also, townspeople and objects can only be slotted into the correct building. You're not allowed to screw around and put people in the wrong houses or anything. That's kind of a shame, because it greatly narrows the sense of problem solving you feel building these towns back up. There are a few things about the Georama that do add some mechanical depth, or if nothing else, a bit of charm. Certain slots on any given building are left without a clear designation. In order to learn what objects you'll need to finish it, you first need to find the inhabitants in an Atla and speak to them. They'll help you narrow down exactly what it is that'll complete their house. For example, Dark Claude wants a box of candy for his house, because he's a fat. Once you've completed somebody's home, their building will be tagged with an event notification. If you walk into their home while this is active, you'll get a little cutscene with them, usually resulting in some kind of a reward. Claude is asleep every time I come for my reward, so I've decided to surround him with a shark-infested moat. That'll wake him up. Okay, this is the bad time. Whatever it is you want to give me from the inside of that tub, I assure you I don't want it. Oh, okay, well I guess that's not so bad. Why is it in quotes? Why is it in quotes? Is it cheese or is it not? Hey, you know what? As long as it's not coming from the inside of that shower, I'll try anything once. In addition to these completion rewards, there's a larger overarching village layout that you can choose to pursue. Speaking to each villager, they'll suggest some subtle preferences in how they want their homes laid out in town. For example, Laura can't stand the screams coming from the mayor's house at night, so building her home on the opposite side of the town from him will satisfy that request. Once you have the entire village arranged according to everybody's picky little specifications, you'll be given a pretty nice reward. In No Rune Village, this unlocks the Windmill Slash, which is an excellent charged attack for Towan. Of course, this necessitates that you track down everybody first, which is kind of a trial in itself. See, Dark Cloud runs at 60 frames per second, which is very nice, but in exchange, the draw distance in this game is about 10 feet in front of Towan at all times. They get around this by swapping villager models with these little blue arrows, but you still have no idea who it's going to be until you're up close. The 14 residents of the village typically stay near their homes, but that's not always the case. There's a day and night system present in the town areas of Dark Cloud. It doesn't affect a whole lot, but some characters seem to abide by a basic sort of schedule. So sometimes you'll find Macho hanging out on his front lawn, other times he'll be cranking his hog behind a tree somewhere, that sort of thing. Thankfully, there are a few nice quality of life features in the Georama. First of all, you can instantly warp to a dungeon without having to manually jog over to its entrance over and over again. Secondly, when you exit edit mode, Toan will warp to wherever your camera is. This means that you can swap to edit mode, move across the entire map, then leave edit mode instead of having to wander around town looking for people. Even though the Georama is pretty simplistic and also hamstrings the game's ability to feature more deliberately built environments, I do like these village sections. No Rune is the first of several settlements, and I find it to be the coziest. I just love the way it looks at sunset, and of course at nighttime, with all the lights on in people's houses and the chimneys puffing up smoke. You can also wander into people's houses and take a look at their stuff, and even switch to a first-person view for a better look if you want. The dialogue of the villagers is pretty stiff, but there's a lot of charm and personality packed into their homes. You can tell a lot about a person just by being nosy and exploring their abode. Details like that go a long way in giving Dark Cloud some color. There's also a lot of treasure chests you can find in town. They'll be tucked away inside of people's houses and even available around the village exterior at times. How often they appear and what kind of loot you can find within them seems to be tied with your progress through the dungeon, so it's worth coming back over and over again to see what kind of new things you can find. A bomb? Cheese? Speed? I don't know what this fucking guy is planning, but I think he should be on a watch list. Having these miracle chests pop up randomly like this is pretty magical. It's like getting a bunch of little Christmas presents every time you visit town. So this first dungeon is called Divine Beast Cave, named after No Rune's protective spirit. While moving through the dungeon, you'll occasionally see a cat skulking around whose purpose is revealed on level 8. It's here where we encounter the Mystery Edgelord. Now look, the kids today, they don't understand, but back in the early 2000s, for an American kid who'd never been exposed to much by way of anime or any Japanese media really, there was nothing, and I mean nothing, as cool as a gray-haired guy with a big sword. The jury's out on the poofy shoulders, I don't know about that, but nonetheless, this is the kind of guy where you print a picture of him off at the local library and then pin said picture to your bedroom wall. Many of these character designs are glorious time capsules, which is kind of funny because Dark Cloud is a game about opening up glorious time capsules. This threatening figure seems to have a real problem with Toan being chosen for the Atlamilia. He hints at truths that Toan himself is not privy to before seemingly being possessed by an evil spirit. He then attacks Toan, which introduces the player to the concept of duels. The game is full of these little quick-time events, just simple games of pressing the right button at the right time. If you can pull it off perfectly, you get a bonus item, but I couldn't do that very often. It's kind of a pointless addition, I suppose, but it's at least not as miserable as Star Fox Adventure's Test of Fear in any case, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, consider yourself lucky. The assailant is held off, but not defeated. Help me, vibrating cat, you're my only hope. Toan is defeated in battle, but the odd man chooses to walk away without finishing his opponent. Back in the village, the cat becomes a cat girl named Zhao, the first of several party members. Well, I'm like totally a human. I'm gonna go out on a limb and suggest that the Valley Girl shtick was a localization choice. Anyway, Zhao joins the party, which means several things for our adventurers. First of all, certain sections in a dungeon can only be reached by making a precarious jump as Zhao. Second of all, she can be switched to at any time while you're in a dungeon. She has her own health bar, her own weapon pool, and she can attack enemies with ranged weapons, which removes some of the risk in combat. The only problem right now is that she sucks. Her damage output is really sad compared to Toan, and enemies can defend against her pretty easily. I mean, come on now, doesn't this look like a real hoot and a holler? It all makes her more of a last resort for now. It's also a bit irritating to hear her meeps every time she does something. I miss when she was just a standard cat instead of this vile homunculus. Once you collect all of the Atla and reach the bottom floor, you'll be face to face with the game's first boss, the divine beast Dran, namesake of the cave. His mind has been corrupted by evil, and it's up to us to take care of him. Now, boss strategies in this game are dramatically different than most standard enemies. First of all, you can probably tell by the way they introduce the bosses that Dark Cloud does crib some elements from Ocarina of Time. Rather than being raw tests of damage, the bosses test your ability to adapt, your reflexes, and how well you know the characters you've recruited. There's a specific methodology to each boss, usually involving you switching to your new character to exploit a hole in their defense, before switching back to Toan to deliver some damage. In this case, you have to use Zhao to hit Dran while he's flying, which forces him to land where you can sneak in a few hits as Toan. Usually bosses will only allow you to hit them once or twice before they become invulnerable again, which is definitely a parallel with the Zelda games too. This means that their HP is relatively low, as your success is predicated more on your ability to perform the correct actions instead of delivering the damage numbers. It's kind of an interesting hybridized system between action-adventure and RPG. In principle, I actually like the way the boss fights are handled. It would have been easy to take the numbers game route, making bosses damage sponges and forcing you to plink away for an hour at a time. Instead, there's some novelty in these encounters, forcing you to swap characters and consider how skills would be best used. I do have a problem with this game, and it's one that's exacerbated with boss fights. The movement in Dark Cloud is rigid, particularly in combat. Bosses like this work in Zelda because the controls are perfectly tuned. They're responsive, allowing for granular changes in a 3D environment. Despite its best efforts, Dark Cloud doesn't recapture this. Animations are quite long and usually uninterruptible, preventing you from rearranging your character in a pinch. The camera is pretty rough as well, swinging from side to side and frequently getting caught on level geometry. Attacking enemies isn't instantaneous. It almost feels like you're issuing a command to Toan and letting him carry it out, as opposed to directly controlling him. Your actions are queued up, making it difficult to cancel out of an animation if circumstances change. These aren't huge problems for the bulk of encounters. For one thing, enemies are very easily interrupted. This means that as long as you deliver a continuous stream of attacks, they won't be able to catch their breath and fight back. When you use a charge attack by holding and releasing the X button, your character is made invulnerable through most of that animation. This is a huge help and a major factor in succeeding here. If you can learn patterns of standard attacks and an enemy's behavior, you can deliver well-timed charge attacks to end encounters quickly. This means that combat, while simple and sometimes monotonous, usually isn't frustrating. This is unless you're ganged up on by many enemies, in which case your strategies will have to change. Throwable items like bombs are best used as panic buttons for such moments. At the very least, there's typically a way around a difficult situation. Encounters here tend to rely less on reflexes and more your ability to plan out animation and vulnerability, stunlock enemies, and take advantage of some questionable hitboxes. It's all fine and dandy when you're dealing with the dungeon's cannon fodder, but the bosses change the game's rules a bit. Suddenly the boss can just drop the floor out from under you with hardly any warning. Or while the camera is swinging around and following you, you'll just be frozen in place. Or you'll hit the enemy and then just take damage afterwards without enough visual information to teach the player why they were hit or how to avoid that next time. The game wants to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to have the Zelda bosses without giving you the Zelda control, feedback, and situational awareness. It leads to more than a few situations where your greatest recourse is just finding ways of exploiting the enemy's AI instead of playing fair. After defeating Dran, he comes to his senses and gives Toan a bit of backstory to chew on. He speaks of a great evil which came to life long ago, the Dark Genie, who destroyed all kingdoms on the face of Terra. It was eventually sealed in a giant cauldron created by the Moon People. It seems like if we're hoping to defeat the genie, we'll need the help of those same Moon People who now live in the woods. Having completed this first dungeon, you've pretty much seen Dark Cloud and can now pack it up and go home. I'm being a little cheeky here, but every subsequent area plays out in a really similar way. You unlock a new zone, you go into its dungeon, you rebuild the town, you gain a new party member, you fight a boss, and you move on. It all becomes quite predictable, with only the environments and music really changing all that much between areas. Our next stop is Matataki Village, which, like Norune, has had its buildings and inhabitants sealed in Otla, which are now in the nearby forest. There's a kid named Goro wandering around here. His father, Fudo, was once the protector of the village. Hey, it's Tom Selleck from the Berserk anime. But Fudo went missing and Goro never learned the truth of his death. As it happens, Fudo was sick with a terminal illness and decided to die in battle with a giant serpent that had terrorized the village. I'm not sure about the ethics of teaching your son to die in war instead of living as a quote-unquote invalid. Jesus, dude. But regardless, this is one of the precious few story cutscenes in Dark Cloud. There are very long stretches of game where nothing really happens. In the plot, everything remains very static, and even in regard to the game's characters, Dark Cloud leaves so much to be desired. Once the initial recruitment of any given character has occurred and their loose ends are tied up shortly after, they will never feature in anything related to the story again. They have nothing to say at any point in time, leaving them feeling about as uninteresting as any of the NPCs in the game. The fun character designs basically carry your perception of them, because I couldn't tell you anything about their personalities. It's too bad. I do like these little storytelling sequences. Nothing too special, but these segments are cute and charming without being too complex. But they just sort of give up on characters after one or two scenes. Skies of Arcadia released the same year as Dark Cloud, and it's a great example of how to tell a simple story. The characters are extremely likable. That's because we see them interact with each other and they weigh in on current events. They have flaws and problems and backstories that unfold. In Dark Cloud, after the introduction of a character, they become nothing more than a tool for you to use in the game's dungeons. I mean, this game was rated T for teen. It's intended for audience who are capable of processing, themes and motivations. It's a shame that the game is so timid when it comes to storytelling. Not to mention, the localization here isn't great. Typically, this is reflected in a lack of proper punctuation, such as, "Odd that the fairy king who never liked humans gave a kid like you the power of that stone." It's a very Christopher Walken delivery.
5 long years he wore this watch. Up his ass.
A lot of the time, you'll just get sentences that were never proofread, like, "Take it easy, brother. Let's just have a talk with to settle this?" I'm of two minds when it comes to this kind of thing. On one hand, it's shoddy and makes the whole experience feel a little half-assed. On the other hand, most of these characters are otherwise so lifeless that the funny mistranslations kind of inject a spark of life into the dialogue. It's a shame because there is charm here. As mentioned, the character designs are pretty great, all things considered. I like the changing textures on Towen's face to create expressions or like bloody noses during a confrontation. I also just happen to think we need more protagonists wearing ponchos. But at the end of the day, it's not a good sign that Toen, who doesn't have any dialogue, injects more life into this story than any other character. Speaking of injecting life into things, I wish someone wouldn't have done that to the Lovecraftian tree monster, and I especially wish that it would stop calling me darling. The Georama goal of Matataki Village is slightly different than No Rune. Rather than plopping down buildings and calling it a day, you have to connect a river which helps restore life to the land, even when many of the godless creatures within it don't deserve that life. Get ye behind me, Satan. This area allows you to situate elevated terrain where buildings can be placed. It's the only area where you can do such a thing, in fact, but I do wish that terrain placement was a focus elsewhere. Strangely enough, it seems like altering terrain was actually intended to be more of a feature based on some of the pre-release footage. I suppose it was just too complex to implement outside of a select few controlled instances. That's kind of interesting to have outdoor dungeons featured. Might be kind of a weird comparison, but it reminds me of the Elder Scrolls Arena. They weren't afraid to have more woodsy sections take the place of traditional dungeons. I dig it. The music in this place is excellent. Considering how many hours you'll be spending in dungeons, it ought to be. Doesn't bode well if you don't immediately jive with the music or visuals of a dungeon here. Completing these areas is quite a time commitment. Given how little things change over the course of a dungeon, qualities like the area's music are one of the few things that can kinda stimulate the player's senses. The soundtrack is quite good and surprisingly memorable too. With so many Georama sections, the game is never short on cozy village music to put you at ease. The music was composed by Tomohito Nishiura, who would go on to compose about 1 billion Professor Layton soundtracks. Much of the ambient music here is very reminiscent of those puzzle-solving tunes from the Layton games. Those types of chilled out yet slightly unnerving tracks are my favorite, and Dark Cloud has quite a few of them. Nishiura demonstrates a really strong understanding of world music, you might say. In Dark Cloud's case, this makes the music a strong factor in differentiating the culture of different areas and also just creating atmosphere. The sound design is somewhat limited, but I can still feel the dusty warmth emanating from No Rune Village. The MIDI instrumentation used is also a little on the cheesy side, but I think it's appropriate given the overall lightheartedness of the game. There's also a lot of traditional instruments used in these tracks, like marimbas and pan flutes, giving it a slightly offbeat flavor for a JRPG. Of course, I have to mention the main theme here too, because it's so good. Don't think I didn't notice those castanets clickety-clacking in the background, Nishiura-san, you sly dog you. We need more ponchos and castanets in RPGs. Why did the innovation die after Dark Cloud? Overall, it's a very enjoyable soundtrack and a huge component of the game's charm. It has a lot of that secondhand nostalgia quality I'd look for in a PS2 JRPG. Considering it was Nishiura's second project in the industry, I'd say it's a slam dunk for the type of game that Dark Cloud is. Eventually, you'll make your way through the forest and face off against the village guardian gone mad yet again, Master Utan? I think it's supposed to be Master Utan, but they had like a character limit or something. Might explain the whole skeleton thing. This is probably my favorite boss fight in the game, actually. You have to bash his foot with Goro's hammer, which causes him to drop to the ground, letting you get some hits in. In between attacks, Master Utan will retreat, chomping and spitting seeds at you. This adds kind of a bullet hell element to the fight, which is fun precisely because his attacks are readable and avoidable. The problem is that, like with so many enemies, his patterns can easily be exploited to end the fight quickly. Depending on how close you move to an enemy, what kind of attack you use, and the way that you approach them, your foes will always respond in the same ways. The enemy AI in Dark Cloud is programmed with a sort of inflexible set of yes or no checks. Once you understand an enemy's AI, it can easily be taken advantage of to trap them in behavioral loops. In fact, sometimes it feels necessary to do this. This is also true of certain bosses, which don't always act in self-preserving ways according to your actions. If you act quick enough and get the timing down, you can often trap the bosses in a loop where they can never escape from damage. It's another point of weakness in Dark Cloud's combat design. After the fight, Master Utan apologizes. That was uncalled for. I don't know why, but that's about the funniest thing a giant ancient monkey god could say in this situation. You know what, bro? All's forgiven. Don't worry about it, where it's water under the bridge. Having restored the village, he takes us to the Moon People. Oh man, I love these guys. Oh, look at the little uppy thing they do when they're talking to you. I just want to scoop them up and give them a big kiss. Alright, so I come in peace. Now I'm being concussed and waterboarded.
This guy, there's a picture of him. Adolf Hitler. Odd-looking duck. His eyes are almost entirely black.
After realizing that we're on the same team, the Moon People free Towen and ask him to find the real Moon People, like the Moon People who are still actively on the moon. Only they would have the magical power necessary to defeat the Dark Genie. In order to accomplish this, we first need to launch their rocket ship. In order to do that, we need to find the Moon Orb, which is... wait, move to Queens. Not a chance. You know what the cost of living is like in New York City? Towen would have to take a second job just to afford a shoebox. I'm staying right here in sweet, affordable Lincoln County, Wisconsin, thank you very much. The Moon Orb is located somewhere in a town called Queens, and the only way to find out where is to undergo what I could only describe as something that is not okay. Could you stop fucking shuffling, please? It seems that the Moon Orb somehow It seems the Moon Orb somehow ended up lost in an underwater shipwreck, which marks our next dungeon. It's at this point I'd like to talk about dungeon crawling in a little more detail. In particular, Dark Cloud's stress-inducing mechanics, thirst, and weapon degradation. Each character has their own thirst meter, which will gradually deplete as you make your way through the dungeon. Once it reaches 0, that character's health will start to drain, at which point you're best off switching to somebody else. The only way to quench a character's thirst is to purchase water for your inventory, or to find a water source on any given floor. This also heals the character who touches it. Unfortunately, this only applies to your currently selected character, so if you want to do a full party heal, you need to just stand here knee-deep in a pool, doing a full rotation every single time. In dungeons, there are limited zones, which force you to contend with particular challenges. Often this means playing only as a specific character, which can be a pain in the ass because certain characters are worse than others. This is especially true if you don't evenly invest your time in all of these different characters, adding a bit of an incentive to grind, one of many, mind you. Another limited zone modifier is making your thirst meter drain much faster than usual, which can be a little anxiety-inducing. In spite of that, thirst mechanics pale in comparison to Dark Cloud's real stress mechanic, weapon degradation. The concept of weapon durability in games elicits a number of reactions. I think for most people it's purely a negative thing. I mean, who wants to have their cool stuff breaking on them, right? A system like this disincentivizes you from using the best weapons you've found. Now, personally, I don't have a problem with durability as a mechanic, but it needs to strike a balance. With any quote-unquote superfluous game mechanic, there's a depth to annoyance ratio that needs to be in harmony. In Fallout New Vegas, for instance, weapon degradation is always a concern, but it can be abated. You can manage it with your repair skill, vendors can fix your gear, weapon repair kits can be crafted, and perks can allow you to jury-rig your weapons back to life. I really like weapon condition in New Vegas. It adds a layer of complexity over top of the proceedings and offers you more diversity in character builds. In this case, the depth clears the annoyance. This may not be the case in Dark Cloud. Here, weapons need to be repaired constantly. Their durability wears out very quickly, more or less depending on the enemy being attacked and the weapon being used. In the beginning, enemies will just shred your gear. It's a bit of a catch-22 because you won't find many weapons in the entry levels of the game. If you break a weapon, it's gone permanently. You can't bring it back to town to repair it for a nominal fee, it's simply erased from your inventory. So you need to buy repair powder, and lots of it. In fact, it's pretty much the only thing you'll be spending your money on in the first part of the game. You really want to get ahead of a weapon when it's at risk of breaking. Waiting until the absolute last second to repair it is a dangerous game, and here's why. If an enemy decides to, say, defend against your attack, the game will count every second that your sword is making collision with the defending enemy as a hit. Each registered hit ticks the weapon's condition down. In a moment like this, you can shred 20 or more durability points off a weapon with one swing. As I mentioned, this game utilizes some kind of action queuing, so even if you realize this and desperately try to cancel out of your next swing, you're already committed and forced to watch helplessly as your weapon just shatters. There's an item called Auto Repair Powder, which when set to an active slot will automatically apply itself to a weapon when broken, and this is an absolute lifesaver at times. But it's also quite expensive when you're in the early stages of the game. Having to constantly keep an eye on my weapon's condition added a level of stress to the game that I was seriously unprepared for. It's utterly heartbreaking to have spent hours upon hours building up a favorite weapon, only to have it break on you because you just weren't mindful enough for a second or two. This weapon condition system is especially consequential due to how Dark Cloud handles character progression. It's not like a traditional RPG where your characters gain experience and levels and stats, what have you. The vast majority of your character's combat prowess is tied to the progression of the weapon, not you, the character. If you want to become more powerful relative to the enemies you're facing, you have to be constantly building up your weapons. As far as your stats outside of the weapon, you've got health, max hydration levels, pocket size, and your character's defense. Consuming a Fruit of Eden increases your max health by 10 points, and consuming any character's favorite food will boost their defense by a little bit too. This type of thing is found in chests that appear as you put Georamas together. Similarly, consuming a gourd will increase your max hydration by 1, and pockets will give you 10 extra inventory spaces, which is probably more valuable than any of the character stat stuff. Between repair powders, water, healing items, and everything else you need for dungeons, you'll run out of inventory space constantly. So being that you find all of this stuff in chests or are given it by certain NPCs after you complete their houses, character progression is tied to your Georama progress. This allows you to pick and choose your favorite characters and boost their health and hydration as you see fit. Everything outside of this is strictly tied to weapons. If you've made it this far, you've probably noticed that I've actually been ragging on this game a fair bit. The combat is mediocre, the degradation systems are stressful, and the story isn't told very well. I must hate this game, right? Well, there is one major thing about Dark Cloud that dug its claws into me and kept me coming back over and over again. The weapon upgrading system. Since weapons are your primary method of character progression, the game features a surprisingly deep and multi-layered system of upgrading those weapons. Every weapon has an ABS gauge, which stands for absorption. It's really just an experience gauge. As you defeat enemies with a particular weapon, its ABS will raise depending on the difficulty of that foe. Once the weapon's ABS is maxed out, you can choose to upgrade the weapon to its next level. This will bump its stats up, but only marginally. To take full advantage of the weapon leveling system, you'll want to use gems. Each weapon has a certain number of attachment slots. Typical attachments fall into one of 3 categories. You've got attribute attachments, boosting things like attack and weapon speed. There are elemental attachments which increase a weapon's magical capability in a certain area. You can manually swap your currently active element in the weapon menu, and in fact you often have to. Some enemies are very weak to certain elements and others will be immune to that same element. You'll want all of your elemental stats to be as high as possible so as to remain versatile. Lastly, there's enemy type attachments. There are 10 different enemy categories in Dark Cloud, such as Metal type, Undead type, or Beast type. Your weapon will have advantages or disadvantages based on its enemy type scores, so these attachments allow you to tweak and boost your proficiency against different enemy classes. All of these attachments can be found randomly in chests, making them fairly common. As a consequence, they only provide moderate boosts. The real holy grails of attachments are gemstones and synth spheres. Synth spheres can be created by sacrificing your own weapons. Once you've used a weapon long enough so that it's been upgraded to level 5 or higher, you can choose to synthesize that weapon's stats down into an attachment. It'll retain 60% of its total stats and can then be attached to a synth sphere slot on another weapon. Leveling up a weapon can take a while, so you probably feel a bit of trepidation breaking it down into a synth sphere, but these attachments have a massive cascading effect, allowing even the worst weapons to become useful. When you level a weapon up, it permanently absorbs its attachments, so hypothetically, you could attach a synth sphere to a weapon, then turn that weapon into a synth sphere, then attach that synth sphere to a weapon, then turn that weapon into a synth sphered, and my god, is it getting hard to say the word synth sphere. Now, the ceiling of a weapon's powers depend not only on its level, but on the kind of weapon it is. This means that even though you can get pretty damn powerful, you can't totally break the game, at least not in the beginning stages. This is where upgrading becomes necessary. Each weapon has its own upgrade path. You can see the requirements for a weapon upgrade by checking the weapon menu. Some weapons might need to have 60 points in holy damage, among some other things. It's different for every weapon. Once you've invested the right attachments into a weapon so that it meets those requirements, it can be upgraded, thus boosting its skill ceiling substantially and often changing its properties too. Each character starts with a base weapon that can't be upgraded. This weapon usually does pretty terrible damage and it's just there in case you've broken everything else. However, all other weapons in the game can be upgraded. This means that even some shitty sword you find in the first dungeon level can become Toan's ultimate weapon if you're willing to put the investment into it. You can choose to take it slow and steady, using attachments to intermittently upgrade those weapons. Or you can choose to keep breaking your weapons into synth spheres, resetting your upgrade progress, but making subsequent level ups easier and easier each time. Aside from synth spheres, gemstones provide hefty boosts in multiple categories. They're much more valuable and precious than typical attachments, but they're also much harder to come by. The most reliable way to find gemstones is to take on the back floors of a dungeon. Each dungeon type has its own back floors. In the case of Divine Beast Cave, you can take a rail car to this area, but this means you have to kill enemies until one of them drops tram oil so that you can use the rail car. There's no way to buy this tram oil from a vendor, so you just have to hope that you'll eventually find some. The payoff is an area with extremely powerful enemies that can usually one-shot you if you're at the right level. If you take on these enemies, they dole out ridiculous amounts of ABS for weapons. Not only that, but back floors are chock full of chests that always contain attachments. You're almost guaranteed at least one gemstone per visit, and that's pretty great. The shipwreck is a great place to hunt for gemstones. It's the only dungeon for which you can actually buy a back room key instead of just crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. You need to feed a fish to this guy, and this guy rocks, but he doesn't like old stanky fish, so you also need to buy ice for your inventory to keep your fish fresh. But ice melts, and then the fish goes bad, so you gotta keep going back and forth to the fish market, buying ice. It's a little bit stressful, but the payoff is that you have constant access to the back floors where you can keep gem hunting. The wild card with back floors is that the gems you find there are going to be random, and each one boosts preset attributes. So if you need a really specific set of elemental boosts in order to upgrade a weapon, you're basically rolling the dice if you head to the back floors, hoping for the best with each run through. It is at this point where the desperate turn to fishing. Far from being a relaxing and fun pastime, fishing in Dark Cloud will give you an ulcer. When you successfully catch a fish, you gain fishing points. You can exchange these fishing points for a number of useful items, including gemstones. In fact, outside of the endgame, this is the only way to purchase them. The benefit is that you get to choose which gemstone you buy. The drawback is that you have to fish. Almost every area in the game has its own fishing hole. The type of fish that appear depend both on the time of day as well as which fishing hole you're at. The rarer the fish, the more FP you'll earn for a catch. Some fish only react to a really specific kind of bait, which can be purchased but are usually found as loot in dungeons. Some fish like potato cakes, others prefer a caterpillar named Mimi, which seems like something my girlfriend would have a 20% chance of crying over for no reason. Most common fish are worth anywhere from 10 to 25 fishing points. You have to wait until they approach the bait, then press and hold X once the lure goes under the surface of the water, and that's pretty much it. Of course, some fish are very bashful, so they can take a very long time to catch. You gather bait and spend ages waiting for a bite, but it goes so slowly and you're so bored that you decide to roll the dice and head to the back floors again for a few hours, hoping you'll find your diamond or whatever you need. But you're not getting it, so okay, you go back to fishing again. But you're out of poison apples, which seems like an unethical piece of bait to use, but it's the only thing that Martingarian bites. And Martingarian is the only fish that's reliably worth upwards of 200 fishing points, but you can't tell when he's in the pond because all the fish look the same, so you have to continually send your lure out, see if you get a nibble, and when you don't, you have to leave the pond and come back to refresh the current fish pool. And sometimes you do this 500 times and still Martingarian doesn't show, but every once in a while he does, and that moment where you catch him blesses you with just enough dopamine to justify continuing your fruitless quest for inner peace and satisfaction with the current state of your weapon. Oh, but look, there's another upgrade. All I would need is 2 diamonds, an aquamarine, and a sapphire. Maybe I can head to the back floors for a few hours to upgrade one of my weapons to +5 and then turn it into a synth sphere and then attach it, thereby circumventing the need to stand here with the fishing pole in my hands for all hours of the night. Dark Cloud is a grind. It is the definition of a grind. When I sat down to play this game, I felt like I was getting ready for a shift, and yet I couldn't stop doing it. This is perhaps partially due to my need to produce content for this channel, but strangely enough, I was driven more by a desire to achieve my own self-imposed micro goals. This game takes advantage of human psychology and brain chemistry in a way that I find insidious yet admirable. Bear in mind, Dark Cloud was released many years before video game companies started hiring teams of evil scientists to hijack the reward centers of the child brain. This is a much more organic kind of video game addiction I'm facing. It's like smoking filterless American spirits. Like, yeah, see, this is how God intended it. Also, I am still going to die of lung disease. Up until Queens, I didn't really understand the appeal of Dark Cloud. I was still hoping that that moment would come. Somewhere in the shipwreck dungeons, though, I suddenly got it. I thought to myself, Dark Cloud, you sneaky bitch. You're just a single-player MMORPG, but with a finish line, which I suppose by definition would just be an RPG. But it has the same trappings, the gear hunting, the skill developing, the just one more isms that I'm all too familiar with having discovered RuneScape back in 6th grade. I thought that I was beyond grinding, but clearly I'm not. Dark Cloud definitively proved that I am not beyond grinding. There are so many things about this game that I actively dislike, but despite my grumbling, I couldn't stop playing. Hook, line, and sinker. The real Martingarian was me, and I was taking a big old bite of this poison apple they call Dark Cloud. So there's a summary of the grind for you. There's 6 playable characters in Dark Cloud, each with their own set of weapons and potential ultimate weapon. As you can imagine, if you're a completionist sort, this game could keep you busy for a very long time. I have my favorite characters and I invest in them, but I don't feel the need to have everybody overpowered. The first character you unlock, as mentioned, is Xiao. She starts out pretty miserably, but she can become reasonably powerful if you put time in. Her slingshots are probably the simplest weapon in the game. You just pull back the string and plink away at the enemy repeatedly. It's a real hoot, as you can see. You can hold the button down, but it doesn't do any extra charge damage. Also, as long as she's attacking, she can't move, which I thought was done to balance the game, but as we'll find out shortly, that's clearly not the case. All other things equal, Ruby outclasses Xiao pretty handily, at least in my experience. Ruby is a genie woman, a good genie, who's released from her lamp by Toan. She's also a projectile-based character, deriving her powers from magical rings. Unlike Xiao, her attacks can be charged, which immediately makes her more useful. The only limiting factor is that her attacks have to be element-based, so if you encounter the odd enemy that's strong against magic, you just have to switch to somebody else. Then there's Goro, who, as we've established, hails from Matataki Village. He joins the party after you sort out his issues with his late father. Hey, why don't you take a long walk off a short pier, you little bastard? Goro uses hammers. He's dreadfully slow and left open to attacks, but his charge ability is pretty awesome. Even his early level weapons are surprisingly powerful, and even though I didn't use him much, he does have his moments. Then there's Ungaga, a warrior from the Muskalaka village. He uses spears and halberds. A lot of people seem to favor him, but I didn't really understand his playstyle. His attacks are really slow compared to Toan's, and yeah, his added range is helpful at times, but I just felt like his combos were clumsy. His charge attack turns his polearm into a propeller, and it's pretty great, but it also shreds through durability, so very limited in its usefulness. Finally, there's Osmond. I was very excited to see him now joined the Ally. In principle, he's the best character because he's a goggle-wearing moon person who fights with submachine guns. He is one of my more played characters. So I don't readily recommend people listen to podcasts or music while playing just any game. Often there's a very deliberately crafted auditory experience and atmosphere that you're kind of missing out on if you're diverting your attention. However, Dark Cloud was made for that shit, so have no shame, listen to whatever you want and don't worry about missing out on a thing. That said, I was cruising around as Osmond using Dran's Feather when this song came on, and I don't know if I was just on the frayed ends of sanity or something, but I left a special note that this must be included in the review, so here you go. None of the characters in Dark Cloud feel all that fleshed out, both in terms of story and gameplay. It seems like they made some commitment to have 6 characters and just kinda had to squeeze them in. As a result, many of the characters play similarly to the point of redundancy. For example, each character has their own traversal ability in dungeons, and I use that term sort of loosely. Xiao can jump across cliffs, Ungaga can spin his weapon to remove darkness, and Goro can hit buttons with his hammer to open doors. Basically, it's just a bunch of different cutscenes that play when you hit X at predetermined points in a dungeon. Ruby can use her elemental blasts to activate crystals, which I found rather annoying as a colorblind man. You have to go into your weapons submenu and make new selections every single time you want to change elements, which is often. Once you get Osmond, you can just fly over Xiao's gaps. Considering he has projectile weapons and can move while attacking, she's just made more or less useless by his presence. That's sort of an issue plaguing the main cast. I stuck with Toan and Ruby for the vast majority of the game and never felt compelled to stick with anyone else. It's interesting that Level 5 felt the need to pack the game with characters and then took sort of a minimalist approach when it came to the game's dungeons. Perhaps they should have considered consolidating all of these characters into, I don't know, 2 or 3? As for how something like that would work out, we can only speculate. As much as the grind may hook you by the shipwreck dungeon, this is also where it may become clear that Dark Cloud doesn't have much to show you. Okay, well, there is this, but alright, this is not the sort of novelty I'm looking for. I've said already that the strongest differences are primarily aesthetic. Rebuilding Queens, for instance, is kinda cool because of those differences. I like the feeling of it being this big Venetian-style city with mafiosos walking around. They're giant cars, market stalls selling a bunch of different items. I like that the fish vendor will actually sell different kinds of fish to you. There's a reason to visit the fish vendor and the water vendor. Stuff like this makes the world feel more alive, gives you a reason to engage with your surroundings. It is a shame that this is so seldom the case. Listen, I apologize, I never would have opened up that Atla if I'd known what monstrosity was lying in wait for me there, okay? With the moon orb in hand, Toan heads to Muskalaka, where he finds the Moon People's ship deep within the Sun and Moon Temple. Launching into space is absolutely one of the best scenes, and once again shows Level 5's penchant for great designs. The ship is just fairy tale excellence. Things silhouetted against the moon are inherently cool. The character designs are what the fuck is this? The Moon People were wascally wabbits this whole time? They better be careful, their home is in extremely close proximity to Matataki Village, which is full of hunters. Hunters that see killing house cats as sport, I might add. Where'd you get those Daisy Dukes, my man? The party ends up in the village of Yellow Drops, which is the only settlement on the moon. The dungeon here, for all intents and purposes, plays out like any other dungeon, but so long as you're at peace with the moon stuff in JRPG trope, you'll probably enjoy the surroundings at least. Rather than building up the local town, which is already built, the Georama aspect of Yellow Drops has you constructing an ancient mecha robot called the Sun Giant. I just love all the bright lights and wacky doodads in here. Music is really mysterious and contemplative, makes you feel like a sun giant mechanic trying to piece this thing together. It's also a nice change of pace from the typical Georama stuff. Like the dungeons, the Georama segments quickly run out of new things to show you, so I think this is a good way of switching it up a bit. Once the Sun Giant is completed, we get to fly it to the Genie's fortress, Dark Heaven Castle. The moon people have lost their powers, but the giant will be more than enough firepower to deal with the genie. Oh yeah, this rules. They knew what the people wanted. Eat shit and die, genie. Oh. Okay. That was the best thing ever. Good things never last in Dark Cloud, and of course this was not the real Dark Genie. It was actually just a rat that wandered into the urn, and inexplicably emerged looking like this and wearing pants and a tiny vest. Colonel Flag is deemed too weak a host by the real Genie. He's abandoned to fall forever in the formless void, which is a surprisingly brutal little ending to his conquest. We arrive at Dark Heaven Castle, where we're greeted by the mysterious man that we last met an entire game ago, a man named Seda. He reveals the nature of the Dark Genie to Toan. Seda is actually the king of the Eastern Kingdom, or he was 400 years ago. In a difficult situation, he was given a choice by a mysterious wizard. Mix your blood with that of a witch to create an unpredictable but terrifying power, or allow your kingdom to be destroyed. Seda agreed and thus crushed the invading force, yet a darkness lived within him. An evil power that wouldn't be realized until one fateful night when grief-stricken and furious, the power manifested itself as the Dark Genie, which would go on to wreak apocalyptic havoc in Terra. A regretful Seda began to research ancient magical methods through which his mistake might be unmade. It's here where he learned of the Atlamillia, a gem which might have the power to dispel the Dark Genie. He knew from his research that the Atlamillia would appear in 400 years' time, so utilizing his archives of forbidden magic, he cast a spell that sent him into the future. The Dark Genie's goal is to rule over everything in all space and time simultaneously, and Seda vowed to never let that happen. Yet the cursed blood flowing through his veins has gradually been taking over his mind and body, and time is running out. Seda uses the last of his power to sacrifice himself, opening the Gallery of Time. He asks Toan, master of the Atlamillia, with moving into the past, ending the genie's cursed existence before it can begin. The following dungeon, it's a Dark Cloud dungeon. Once again, the creative spin is with the Georama. Rather than collecting physical objects or town citizens, you're collecting fragments of Seda's memories. Only by reconstructing these memories in the Georama can you understand the full context of what's happened. It's quite simple mechanically, you just slot together objects and people from Seda's memories the way you would with any building in the game. But it's a unique spin on the concept, and the resulting cutscenes are quite good. Rather than having the story told from an objective point of view, it's strictly told from Seda's perspective. All of his feelings and biases are laid clear to us as we learn of his father's passing and the responsibility that weighed heavily on his shoulders. This is why he so readily accepted the dark power. It wasn't just a matter of winning the war, it was a matter of measuring up to his father and honoring him. We learn that he fell in love with the princess of a nearby kingdom, becoming engaged to her and losing her when an imposter infiltrated the castle and took her life. The grief, fury, and sadness commingled with his blood, manifesting as the Dark Genie, an embodiment of pure hatred. See, this is the fairy tale I've been waiting for. I like these cutscenes a lot. I like the music, I like the themes and symbolism, simple as they may be. When people act in hatred, they often destroy not only that which they hate, but they themselves and everything they love as well. Vengeance driven by hate is not a precision tool. This is physically characterized by the Dark Genie. By the time Seda realizes what his hate has wrought, it's far too late, and still he finds ways to repent, which culminates in the sacrifice of his life, the only thing he's got left to offer. It's just a nice sequence, and I really wish that this level of storytelling was present in the other 98% of the game. There are good moments, and they do embody this notion of reading a story from an old book, but the plot beats are thin and spaced so far from each other. This is a bit of a lore dump, yes, and it's not exactly an elegant way of telling a video game story, but we got something to chew on here. It's got heart, kid. I actually kind of care about Seda now, despite the fact that I haven't seen him since like the beginning of the game, and in fact kind of forgot he existed. The Dark Genie as a villain is more interesting now, moments after I meet him and moments before I fight and kill him. It's clear that Level 5 had some ideas for a story here, many of them good, but they just didn't know how to tell it. Towen finds himself within Seda's memory, the night of the assassination. Unfortunately, despite his knowledge of that night's events, the assassin is still able to kill Seda's lover, as though it were fated to happen. The Dark Genie manifests just like before, but this time he's up against the Atlamillia. This fight sucks so much ass, man. It looks cool, the genie's design is great, I like the weird fleshy Lovecraft cavern, but mechanically it's pretty rough. The genie has all these unavoidable attacks, and I literally mean unavoidable. You'll just receive damage and get knocked down because fuck you. In case you can't tell, I've become somewhat exhausted by the game's repetitive nature towards the end, and that charitable spirit I like to extend towards most properties is waning. The reality is that somewhere in the Sun and Moon Temple, several dungeons ago, I managed to build Towen's ultimate weapon, Chronicle. Chronicle is the best sword in the game. Sort of. More on that shortly. It absolutely shreds through enemies, and of course, by the time you've made it through the Chronicle upgrade path, it's almost maxed out with every damage type. The pursuit of weapons like Chronicle is the foundation of that hyper-addicting gameplay loop I was describing earlier. This leads to a problem. What the hell do you do once you have Chronicle? Reaching goals like this renders so many of the game's facets unnecessary. All of the sudden hunting for attachments, fishing, looking for backfloor keys, all of that stuff sort of feels meaningless. I mean, you could max out every weapon for every character, but it's just kind of arbitrary. Once you have a couple of good weapons, the dungeons stop providing any kind of inherent value to the game. This leads to the latter part of the game dragging its feet as you rush to complete dungeons. After all, dungeons are so samey, there's no reason to stop and smell the roses. Your weapon is demolishing the enemies, you just want to get it all over with at that point, which is not a great feeling for a video game to spur in a player. So after many hours of repetition, having to deal with a boss that can knock you on your ass, busting up the pacing of the fight, I have to admit, I'm left a little impatient. But I was happy to have it over and done with. The genie is destroyed, but his existence will only truly be erased if Seda's hate energy can be dispelled. Consuming the last of the Atlamillia's power, Towen and the Fairy King bring Seda and the princess back to life, undoing the assassin's rather shoddy work. Towen heads back to the present time, undoing the Dark Genie's reign of terror and saving the day. There's Dark Cloud for ya. My feelings on this game are all over the map. There is so much wrong with it on a fundamental level. If I could measure the amount of fun I was having playing the game, I think that those fun levels would consistently be on the lower end. But good lord man, did they find a way to weaponize the grind in this thing. That's what this game is, it's a grind, through and through. If you're a fan of the grind, this game is going to be great for you. If you prefer your games to have tight pacing, a steady trickle of novel gameplay mechanics or story elements, and an expertly directed ebb and flow that captures the imagination and ignites the senses, Dark Cloud will probably be a monument to everything you hate in this world. So many components of its difficulty are just annoying. You'll be in your menu several times a minute, drinking water. Oh, now I gotta repair my weapon. And you gotta swap the element of your weapons to make them effective. You gotta change characters, alter your attachments. By the end of the game, it's hard to not let out a big old sigh every time you have to open the menu. Yet, as a weapon management simulator, Dark Cloud hooked me, and as dirty as I feel admitting it, I didn't want it to let go. If you're a goal-oriented player, somebody who loves plotting out and actualizing micro-objectives, there's a lot to like here. The weapon upgrade system is legitimately great, allowing for this kind of upward mobility you only begin to understand after spending many hours with it. And even outside of the virtual spreadsheet aspects of Dark Cloud, this game's got some nice qualities, I don't want to understate that. The visual style is quirky and easy on the eyes, and the music is great. Level 5 really had an eye for charm in their cutscenes, character designs, even in like the minor UI elements and stuff like that. To be amorphous about it, the game has a great vibe. I wish that the dungeons had some depth, and that the story was paced a bit better, and that the characters existed after their initial introductions. But for a first effort on a new console, Dark Cloud showed a lot of promise. However, those last few endgame dungeons took a lot out of me, so I think I'm good on Dark Cloud for quite a while. Oh, you can continue from your endgame save. There's a new area on the map here. The Demon Shaft? Oh no, this is a bonus dungeon, isn't it? It ain't gonna happen today, and it ain't gonna happen tomorrow, but I don't know, maybe someday I'll do the Demon Shaft. Later that day, I started the Demon Shaft, and I'm not happy about it. The Demon Shaft is a bonus endgame dungeon that was never present in the original Japanese version of the game. This dungeon is 100 floors long. For comparison, that is more floors than every single dungeon in the base game combined. The enemies of the Demon Shaft are souped-up versions of the many enemies you've fought already. This means exploiting their elemental weaknesses is key, and that means switching elements even more often here. Some enemies love standing around and blocking every attack. Please, just take your punishment. We both know you're going to die. Some enemies love to hang out in groups and make it effectively impossible for you to single them out and deal with them. Many enemies are just obnoxious. This also means that Ruby is the new MVP. Ruby's ultimate weapon doesn't do as much damage as Chronicle, but the benefit is that she doesn't have to get close to enemies. By the way, just to refresh your memory, any weapon can break. I could break Chronicle right now, totally by accident. I could literally undo dozens of hours of grinding just by not paying attention. No, I'm just kidding, it's not gonna happen, but for real, you should save before you go into a dungeon, have some auto repair powder on your bar at all times. Even if you ignore all the bells and whistles of the dungeon, the chests and the back floors and everything, you still have to kill every enemy until one of them drops the next floor key. In this case, it's an item called the Black Knight's Crest. Again, this is weirdly often the last enemy on the floor, so even if you're speedrunning, there's some degree of randomness dictating how long you have to spend on each floor here. Unless you've made it to this point without grinding your weapons to a high level, the purpose of so many gameplay mechanics is even more null and void here. You're basically autonomously moving through the dungeon at a certain point, it's just muscle memory. Every 20 floors the enemy pool changes, so even if you had all of the enemy's elemental weaknesses memorized, yeah, you're gonna have to throw all that info out the window now. You got like 10 new enemies that'll force you to test out your elements again until you memorize their weaknesses. The Demon Shaft exacerbates everything I dislike about Dark Cloud without any of the sweet incentives that once kept me invested. The thing is that it's entirely optional, so I can't even hold it against the game. I volunteered to work overtime just for the sake of completion. So I got my routine down, conquering the Demon Shaft one floor at a time, and at long last, I reached the final floor. This is where you fight the game's optional boss, the Black Knight Pendragon. Some people theorize that the knight is actually Toen's father. His existence is hinted at throughout the story, but you never get any firm answers, so I like this idea. Fighting the physical embodiment of your sensei's spirit in fair combat will always be at the top of the coolness list. It helps that this fight is actually pretty fun, and one of the better boss battles in the game. You're essentially playing Matador in the first phase, baiting the Black Knight to charge at you and getting some shots in while he's immobilized. His health pool is a little bloated, but it's fun enough. The second phase is a one-on-one duel, well, I guess 1-on-6 if you consider the tag teaming. It's slightly more technical, but still has a bit of that I don't really understand what hit me or how I could have avoided it thing that the base game's bosses have. It's still a good fight though, provided you've stocked up on supplies. Akihiro Hino stated that his perfectionism is what drove him to tweak the American release of Dark Cloud. With that in mind, the Black Knight is quite a bit better than the base game's bosses, and you can see some lessons learned in his design. With this boss defeated and the Demon Shaft over with, you're finally given your reward, the Chronicle 2. I didn't know there was a sequel. This weapon is like Chronicle, but better in every way. Not a bad reward. Maybe I'll do a New Game Plus someday and test this bad boy out. Say, where's the New Game Plus option? Where's the New Game Plus option, level 5? Let me just get this straight. You go through the entire demon shaft for a sword that serves no purpose? I mean, you wouldn't use it. You've already done the super difficult, challenging dungeon optional quest at the end of the game. It's just there to be looked at, like a little ribbon pinned on your suspenders. A little ribbon that says, "Good job, sport. You did it. You did the thing." Well, okay. Tristan, my promise has been fulfilled. Next time you mention finding Chronicle or the Demon Shaft or pumpkin panty fortune telling, I will be there armed with knowledge and prepared to commiserate. That said, I am done with Dark Cloud. I am done with anything Dark Cloud related. I don't want to hear the name Dark Cloud for a while. I don't want to play any game with the name Dark Cloud in the title. Nothing, and I mean nothing, will change my mind about that. I know it's called Dark Chronicle in every region except for North America, but the joke doesn't work if I don't call it Dark Cloud too. Despite Dark Cloud's abysmal Japanese sales, Level 5 immediately began work on a sort of soft reboot. They knew that the concepts were sound, it was just a matter of sanding down, refining, and finding new avenues to reach the target audience of JRPG fans. Development of Dark Chronicle had actually begun prior to Dark Cloud's release in North America, which of course had resulted in unexpected blockbuster success. So Dark Chronicle became Dark Cloud 2 in North America, capitalizing on their overseas success while wiping the slate clean for a fresh start domestically. Level 5 was only a small studio when they'd started on Dark Cloud, but now they'd grown to over 100 employees. The studio was familiar with the PS2's hardware at this point, and Hino desired to correct the perceived missteps with Dark Cloud. The original game's code was scrapped and a new engine was built from scratch. The purpose here was to create a game that looked and played so much better than its predecessor that RPG fans would have no choice but to take notice. And boy did they. Dark Chronicle was released in Japan in November of 2002, a little less than 2 years after the original, with a North American release following 2 months later. Then a European one like 7 months after that. I'm sorry, Europeans, you guys always seem to get the short end of the stick. But hey, you got Deep Fear, and nobody can take that away from you.
It's howling at the top of its lungs.
Anyway, Tristan, for as much as he adores Dark Cloud, never cracked open the sequel, which I find so peculiar. My personal debt starts and stops with that first game, but I know myself. I believe that I'll be spiritually disquieted until my work is finished here. I gotta make it through this series. So let's take a look at Dark Chronicle. As the game begins, we see a young woman running through the halls of a castle. She enters her father's room in a panic, but it's too late. He's been struck down, slain by a mysterious gray-haired man who escapes the scene of the crime through a portal, leaving the girl hopeless and alone. We abruptly switch perspectives, following a young man named Maximilian. Max is voiced by Lloyd, so you know we're in for a good time.
Yeah, I guess, but take a look at this. I got a ticket for Flotsam's circus troupe.
You're a worthless jerk who couldn't give up his social status even for his own wife.
Max works for a machinist, an old man named Cedric. Cedric is voiced by Roy Campbell, so you know we're in for a good time.
Gable's vacuum is set up below. Go to it, lad. I pay money to my ex-wife as part of our divorce settlement, among other bills.
Max lives in the pleasant little town of Palm Brinks, where a circus happens to be visiting. While attending the circus, Max overhears the circus ringleader, a man named Flotsam, putting the screws to Palm Brinks' mare.
I don't tolerate excuses!
Flotsam is voiced by whoever the hell this guy is, so you know we're in for a good time.
Oh, I can smell it. I can smell it! The stone is in this town! Absolutely!
Seriously though, this guy delivers the performance of a lifetime. Apparently, Flotsam is looking for a mysterious stone, a stone that Max has been given by his father. Flotsam becomes wise to this, chasing Max throughout Palm Brinks on the back of his wacky wailing inflatable arm-flailing robot man. This forces Max to hide in the town sewers where his friend Donnie lives.
What happened out there? Who are those guys?
Donnie is voiced by Jimmy Neutron, so you know we're in for a good you know what? Let's just acknowledge this in one fell swoop, alright? Dark Chronicle's voice cast is pretty damn stacked. Considering that Dark Cloud didn't even have voice acting, well, not really anyway, being conversationally serenaded by the likes of Cam Clark, Jennifer Hale, Debbie Derryberry, that's such a sick-ass name, it's unexpected. This entire opening sets the stage for a far more cinematic adventure than the previous game. The cutscenes are well-directed, fun, dynamic, and colorful. The game weaves in and out of cutscenes and short little player-controlled tutorials, then back again. It's all held together with some characteristically charming world design, and the voice performances are the icing on the cake here. Some of the animations a little stiff, and the voices get cut off here and there, which is actually kind of hilarious.
Well, if it isn't my favorite roasted chestnuts.
But taken for what it is, that being a 2002 PS2 RPG, Level 5 really put their cards on the table in terms of how much they'd improved since Dark Cloud. So Max, determined to find out the truth of his mysterious pendant, makes his way through the sewers in an effort to escape the city. Here he finds an entire world just waiting to be explored and a companion named Monica, the girl from the intro, who joins him on his quest. Where do I even begin is about the most cliché way to kick off a discussion on anything, but you know, clichés exist for a reason, and never has this particular one been more appropriate. Dark Chronicle is a veritable interactive piñata stuffed with gameplay and seemingly endless possibilities. The bones of Dark Cloud are here. This is a dungeon crawler in which you travel through procedurally generated levels, collecting materials that can be used to build up different communities. Collecting a large variety of weapons and upgrading those weapons are still huge components of the game, but all of this carryover from Dark Cloud only scratches the surface of Dark Chronicle. Let's start with those elements that Chronicle shares with Cloud. You'll notice immediately in the sewer section that the combat simply feels better. There's a sort of forgiving looseness in the movement, and as a result of it, your momentum isn't halted nearly as often as it is in Dark Cloud. Both in terms of animation blending and in the changing player states, there's a much more organic sense of ebb and flow in battles. Tilting the stick in a particular direction, you can perform different combos, using charge attacks or jump slashes to close the distance. You can even perform a backflip dodge by tilting away from the enemy mid-combo. This is really helpful in those moments where you're being overwhelmed. These controls are a bit finicky, sometimes a move won't come out even when it seems like it should, and this can lead to some frustration. Taken as a whole though, the controls here are far more geared towards fast-paced action combat than the original. Instead of having to switch to a party member who has access to a ranged attack, both Max and Monica have melee and ranged options at the same time. By holding down L1 and pressing the attack button, Max will pull out a gun and start firing it at the target, and Monica will send magic blasts from her bracelet, which is distinctly less cool. It goes without saying that this gives you much more maneuverability in fights, but I'll say it anyway, this gives you much more maneuverability in fights. Focusing on just 2 characters was the right call. The additional 4 aren't missed at all here. There's nothing any of those schmucks could do that Max and Monica can't. When an enemy is soaring high above you, you don't have to swing your sword or charge attack hoping you'll make contact with it. Nor do you have to pause the game, interrupting the flow of combat while you cycle through a list of characters, selecting somebody with a ranged attack just to swap back afterwards. You just pull out a gun and shoot them. See, you can tell Dark Cloud was only successful in America because they applied a very American lesson to this game. If it doesn't have a gun, you should add one. If it does have a gun, you should make it easier to shoot it. Simple as.
The purpose of what I'm trying to illustrate to you here today,
The enemy behaviors in Dark Chronicle are varied and less predictable, so having instant access to different attacks is a big help. You've also got quick access to either character, requiring you to only click down the left stick to swap between them. It takes a second to load in the character model, but it's still a far sight faster than going into the menu. The different weapon types mean several types of repair powder. You've got melee weapon powder, gun powder, and armband powder. That might sound like an annoying level of micromanagement, but it actually removes pressure from the player. As long as you're exploring each level of a dungeon thoroughly, you'll find so many resources that you'll probably never have to buy armband or firearm powder unless you're exclusively using those weapons. If your back's against the wall, picking up and breaking rocks is usually a good way of replenishing supplies. It's nice for people who prefer to just stay in the dungeon and only go to town when they have to. On the topic of pressure being relieved, I've got some good news for those of you who play video games to avoid stress rather than to participate in it. First of all, there are no kidney stone mechanics here, so you don't need to drink water anymore. Thirst as a mechanic now operates as a simple status effect. That slowly declining meter in the top left corner of the screen, forcing you in and out of menus and sprinting around looking for pawns, yeah, that's no more. And I have to say, the game does not suffer for its absence. I at no point thought to myself, God, I wish my character was thirsty right now. Perhaps even more of a relief is the weapon durability system. It's still here, but nowhere near as punishing. If your weapon breaks in Dark Chronicle, it's only temporarily unusable. You can repair it at any time as long as you have the right repair powder. No more stress, no more panic, no more withholding your favorite weapons because you're scared of breaking them. Again, the game is only strengthened for these changes to its systems. To balance some of these conveniences, death is much more punishing. If you're party wiped in Dark Cloud, you can choose to pay half of your gold to respawn. In Chronicle, you're kicked to the main menu and forced to reload your most recent save. You'll likely die quite a bit in the beginning of the game, so this can cause some lost progress if you're not fastidious about saving. At the very least, Chronicle lets you save your game in between dungeon levels, which is a really nice addition. Once you leave the sewers, you're introduced to the wider world, and this is where Dark Chronicle becomes interesting. Strictly speaking, this is a post-apocalyptic game. 15 years ago, one Emperor Griffin destroyed most of the world but for the town of Palm Brinks. He knew he'd find a stone there, the Otlamillia, something he needed, so he left it untouched for now. I probably don't need to mention this, but that's Max's pendant. If I had $1 for every 6th generation console RPG character voiced by Scott Menville that has to carefully guard a crystal that's intrinsically tied to his parents, I'd have 2 smackers, baby. But yeah, it's intrinsically tied to his parents. In fact, the game is sort of told from the perspective of a post-adventure Maximilian. With each chapter interlude, he speaks directly to his mother, who, as far as we know, is no longer in his life. He tells her about all the adventures he's had and all of the things he's learned. I like this post-apocalyptic spin. It's not as if it's a hopeless or depressing world, aside from the knowledge that many people died in a calamity, but it's a good reason to get out there and rebuild. For better or for worse, this means that Dark Chronicle also has a time-traveling component in its story and its gameplay. Monica, who we've seen in the game's intro, came from 100 years in the future. Like Max, she holds an Otlamillia, one of very few. It's this stone that's allowed her to hop between time periods. In order for her future to be saved and to rally resistance against Griffin, the two must join forces and repair the past. Obviously, this brings up so many time travel related questions and potential plot holes that if you give a shit about that sort of thing, you could probably get real steamed up thinking about it. I'm gonna level with you. I don't care. It's not because I don't care about stories, I do very much. I just don't find hypothetical time travel related plot holes interesting unless they're so glaring that it disrupts my ability to suspend my disbelief. Part of the reason Dark Chronicle gets a hall pass for its paradoxical shenanigans is because the plot here isn't of great interest to me anyway. It's a fine enough reason to get out there and start doing some dungeon crawling, but honestly there's nothing all that captivating here. It's a very simplistic story with one-dimensional characters. They're cute archetypes and there's some charming interactions, but this is hardly an edge-of-your-seat experience. I say as a decrepit old man, so I don't know, your mileage may vary. I couldn't even really describe Monica's personality, and I spent an entire game playing as her. Despite that, the story does add some much-needed structure to the proceedings. In Dark Cloud, you could go for hours at a time without so much as a dialogue box. When cutscenes did occur, they were pretty stiff, both in terms of dialogue and animation. The improved production values and focus on storytelling here adds more welcome disruptions to the dungeon crawling process. You'll frequently have cutscenes between floors where you're introduced to new characters or given some internal monologuing from Max. It's never long-winded or obnoxious enough to have you skipping through dialogue, but it's a nice little way of injecting some context and color into the mundanity. As little investment as I have in the game's plot, I do appreciate the quirky fairy tale setups they've established in each area. Take the game's first post-tutorial area, the Forest of Sindane. We stop here because we've got to contact Sindane's elder. Oh my god, it's gonna be the scary tree, isn't it? You're gonna make me talk to that scary tree again, and it's gonna call me darling. The elder tree supposedly has valuable information about Emperor Griffin, but said tree was killed by Griffin in Monica's timeline. Therefore, we must build Sindane in the past in order to ensure its future goes as planned. Going through the forest dungeon, we have to find this game's equivalent to the Atla, which are called geostones. Instead of having each floor littered with these, you'll typically only find one Atla per level. This is unambiguously good, because it means you don't have to spend half your time on each level watching an unskippable Atla opening animation only to be rewarded with something shitty like a road or trees. When you return to the area's Georama, you can pilot a flying ship called the Carpenterian, which is meant to be what's building the town.
With this thing, you can make anything you want.
Please tell it to start fracking immediately. All of your geostones are uploaded simultaneously into the Carpenterian, allowing you to craft whatever objects you've unlocked. Unlike Dark Cloud, where you can just place what you found, here you have to gather crafting components and assemble the objects first. And this is why I said, where do I begin? Because, man, this is actually like 700 different things rolled into one. So plug your seatbelt in, grab a Sunny D, and dim the lights, because you and me are going on a car ride straight to hell, and you're riding shotgun. Okay, might be setting the expectation a little high here. Dark Chronicle has a crafting system. Actually, it has a couple, but we'll just umbrella them all under the term crafting system. We live in the modern world. Crafting is basically a mandatory component of any new game under threat of government-sanctioned execution. So when I tell you that Dark Chronicle has one of the most extensive crafting systems I've ever seen in a game, know that I mean it. Alright, enough filibustering, let's talk about it. First things first, the train. Max's mentor Cedric has built a train, the Blackstone 1. Where previously travel outside of Palm Brinks was made illegal by the mayor, controlled by Griffin, Cedric says, "You know what, mayor, I don't need you or your damn bureaucracy." So he fires up the train and decides to chauffeur Max and Monica around on their adventure. The train acts as a sort of mobile hub base that follows you between areas. What makes the train useful as a gameplay tool is that, depending on your own hard work as the player, it'll gradually come to act as a mobile version of Palm Brinks. Typically, when you need weapons or items or certain crafting materials, you have to travel back to town, which thankfully can be done from almost anywhere instantly. From there, you can visit all the little shops and houses, speaking to people and purchasing goods. It may shock you to learn that most of these people are willing to upend their entire lives to join you on the Blackstone 1, provided you complete some kind of challenge or meet a qualification. The Sheriff of Palm Brinks, a city that is rife with organized crime, including a group of clowns that strap bomb vests to themselves purely out of spite. Yes, the sheriff of this hole will just up and leave if you can run to the pond and back in 2 minutes or less. What do we need the sheriff for? Who gives a shit? Get him on that train. Do it, now. Bread acts as a healing consumable for dungeons. While normally you'd have to go to Polly's bakery to buy more, you can just get Polly on the train with you, granting you access to loaves upon toothsome loaves of farm-fresh train bread. Only first you need to run a bunch of errands for her, dealing with a town-wide wild goose chase. Nothing good is without its cost here. You can get the mayor on the train. The mayor that is the mayor of the evil clown town. They need his leadership right now, but I'll leave the town in the hands of fate as long as you can help him get his safe open. And you still might be asking yourself, what is the point of getting all of these people on this train? And the answers to that are manifold. For one thing, you can choose to have a single auxiliary party member at any time. You can't use them in combat the way you can with Max and Monica, but their presence in the party provides you with useful passive bonuses. For example, Polly will automatically make bread for you while she's in the party, and the mayor will increase the amount of gold you earn from killing monsters, just stuff like that. The other reason to go on these recruitment drives is because each of these characters has a unique set of items they'll sell you. Some will sell you materials for weapon upgrading or healing items. Many of them will sell you crafting materials, and this is likely how you'll get the bulk of those materials. The only other way to find components is in dungeons. They'll sometimes be in treasure chests or earned from slaying monsters. The problem is that you can't exactly pick and choose what you need, and you burn through materials quickly in the Georama. So you'll need to buy them from your passengers, and that means you need a lot of gold, which is all the more reason to go through dungeons again and again. There are two distinct types of crafting here: Georama crafting, which has you expending resources to build objects from blueprints, and inventing. Inventing allows you to combine Max's different ideas into crafting schematics, which can then be built from the menu. These are often built using the same materials as you would use in the Georama. You can build weapons, healing items, nearly everything that enters your inventory can be built by hand. As mentioned, this requires you to combine ideas. Selecting 3 correct ideas will formulate an invention schematic. How do you gather ideas? I'm so glad you asked. Early on, you're given a camera and told to start snapping photos of pretty much everything. This game is full of random tchotchkes, baubles, odds and ends, and nearly every one of them represents a different idea. Snapping a photo of something new, you'll see the subject of the photo named at the bottom. From there, you can head into your Make menu, where new photos can be registered permanently in your Ideas folder. Once they're there, you can delete the photos to make room for more, as you can only have 30 active photos at a time. New recipes can be learned through experimentation or by finding little notes and messages hidden throughout the world with recipes on them. You can make some powerful items by combining these photos, and the game does a pretty commendable job of gating your progress in that area without stifling you. What I mean is that many of the higher level items require photos that you probably won't be able to snap until you've made some progress in the main story. In order to make a high quality gun, you might need a picture of a generator that you're only going to see in the game's final chapters. The possibilities for item creation are always high, but it never tilts the game unfairly in your favor. There are certain special photographs, often time sensitive, that Donnie asks for. These are called scoops. This might be a photograph of a stage end boss doing their signature move, or a unique character who only briefly appears in the game. This means that not only are scoops missable, but sometimes you only have seconds to capture them. Often, but not always, once you've lost a scoop, you've lost it for good. So if you want to fill in your album, you'll need to keep on top of these. Scoops are often needed for some special inventions too, so it sucks to have missed one. As you take pictures, your photography level will gradually be raised, at which point Donnie will offer you some special rewards. It's not an insignificant part of the game, I'll put it that way. I can understand why going around shooting photos of mundane objects might seem like busy work. To break from dungeon crawling and everything else the game has to offer, it could be seen as a pacing issue. For this reason, I acknowledge this aspect of the crafting system probably could have been pared down a bit. I mean, there is a ridiculous number of items that are tagged as photographable, and sometimes there's only 1 or 2 of any given type in a specific place you wouldn't think to look. That said, I really like this part of the game. The reason for that is mainly owed to the game's central town, Palm Brinks. I love this town, I love this town, I love it much despite the clown. If there's any generalized praise I can shower level 5 with across all of their games, it's that they understand how awesome bucolic towns can be. Even when many don't, because bucolic is sort of a weirdly specific word, but by God is it applicable here. Comfy, cozy, soulful, Palm Brinks is peak RPG townage. As the only hand-designed town in the game, it carries a lot of weight, but it does so with grace. It's like every beautiful little European small-town stereotype rolled into one place. There are cafes at the harbor side, an ornate cathedral at the center of town, quaint fishing ponds surrounded by a pleasant forest. It's just nice to walk around in. One of my favorite parts of the original game was just wandering around inside of people's houses. There was always so much personality in the adornments and layouts that they chose. This is absolutely true in Palm Brinks. Each house is this wonderful little reflection of the people who live there. The artist's house is full of half-finished statues, tubs of paint, and avant-garde decorations. Each room of Max's father's house says something about the people who frequent it. Even the placement of lights and how that light interacts with objects gives the rooms a unique aesthetic, often very warm and welcoming. There's so much variety in what types of things you'll see in people's homes while wandering around. The reason I feel so much affinity for the photography system is how it charges these environments with purpose. It's so easy in video games, RPGs especially, to just cruise past these meticulously made levels with their little odds and ends tucked away in forgotten corners. It's so necessary for the sense of life in an RPG to have this optional, seemingly inconsequential exploration. But all too often, it's easy to take this for granted. If there's no loot or important characters nearby, I have to admit my dopamine-addled brain often doesn't take the time to slow down, relax, and appreciate the artistry of the environmental and character design. The photo system ostensibly gives you a reason to do that without shoving it down your throat. When I was a kid, I loved those I Spy books, particularly the locations in the pictures. Once you have a notion of the photos you'll need for a recipe, the photography system becomes a sort of game in and of itself. I love checking out the different vantage points. I love the sound of a successful photo having been taken. I love the way that NPCs react in different ways to having a camera pointed at them. I just appreciate the photography. At the same time, I do understand why some would see it as a needless inconvenience. Some people have uploaded save files online with all photos already taken just to avoid this part of the game. I think if you look at it as a checklist where you need to collect all of the scoops and you have to have all of the inventions, yeah, it's going to become a miserable slog. But the system is introduced to you with the spirit of leisure and relaxation. For my money, the concept of stopping and smelling the roses is an important part of Dark Chronicle, and one that was woefully lacking from its predecessor. As for the Georama crafting, the system here is more extensive than it was in Dark Cloud. Now, instead of building people's preset houses with minimal player input, you can build individual components and place them with a specificity that wasn't possible before. You can build fences around people's houses, place torches near their front doors, or build trees and really get particular about placement. Objects are no longer bound to grids and can be rotated in many different directions. In order to finish a Georama, you have to complete a list of objectives, unique to each one. Some of these objectives are obscured at first, showing up in the analysis as question marks, but they gradually become clearer as you make your way through the area dungeon and find more geostones. You'll have to build things in a specific way and also hit a culture point threshold. Culture points are gained simply by making the area less horrible to live, at least in theory. So having plenty of greenery, some decorative objects, maybe gates or walls for certain parts of town, basically just making it more beautiful and town-like. You can paint people's houses, adjust their elevation and add stairs, or add adornments to those houses like chimneys to the roof or lamps on the side wall. This type of thing will increase your culture score. Of course, you can't just build a bunch of benches and shove them together and that'll jack your culture score up too. The more houses that are in the vicinity of a culture object, the more points it'll net you. The game places a limit on how much of one particular object you can make per area, but it's pretty easy to farm points nonetheless. This is actually not necessarily a bad thing because the Georama isn't going to be everybody's cup of tea. It's cool being able to tweak and build up your towns to a degree that you couldn't before, but it's also a big time and resource investment. Not everybody's in it for the city building, some people just want to get that part over with. The game makes it reasonably easy to fire off the bare necessities and move on, if that's your goal. If you want to get real creative about your layouts, you have much more freedom than Dark Cloud to do this. That game's system could barely even be called a prototype for this one, they're so different. The one thing I do miss about Dark Cloud's Georama is having everybody's houses full of their personal effects. In Chronicle, you build a generic house and can then assign a passenger from the Blackstone 1 to that house. Certain assignments are necessary to have that area's completion rate at 100%, but you can still put people wherever you want. The thing is, all of the houses you can build for them are generic and pre-made, so you're never going to get that same kind of interior personality as you did in the original. The game puts a bit of a spin on the typical Georama rules as well. Sindane is straightforward enough in its completion, but later areas abide by different sets of rules. Balance Valley must be precariously situated atop 4 large pillars in the center of a canyon. Too much weight on one pillar will cause it to drop down while the others are pushed back up. You have to meet the Georama requirements while perfectly balancing the weight of all 4 pillars. It does create some restrictions on your ability to let loose and get creative, but as is often the case, I find these restrictions actually make things more interesting. Without the freedom to just plop buildings down and forget about them, you have to be a lot more mindful of your placements. It turns the simplicity of the Georama into a bit of a puzzle. Furthering these puzzle elements is the time-traveling mechanic. Within each Georama, you'll find a teleporter that'll take you to the same location but 100 years in the future. Bit by bit, you'll see how your actions in the past will affect the same location many years from now. Just to make it clear, the changes don't reflect the specific actions or placements that you've made. Rather, the future areas are set in stone, but your past completion ratio affects how finished the future is. The future is where you'll find the customary progression items, such as HP increases and defense boosts, so there's incentive to max out your completion ratio for each map. The time travel isn't exactly a flexible system, not that you would expect it to be, but it's still a fun way of tying the Georama to the story and feeling a sense of tangible progress being made. For example, the area Heim Rada is located in a volcanic mountain wasteland. Someday, this will be the location of the Gundurata workshop, where a resistance will be mounted against Emperor Griffin. In order to achieve this, you have to settle the inhospitable zone in the present. The massive cranes that allow Gundurata to move its hefty machinery will only manifest if a little crane is built in the past. Same goes for the city's multi-layered construction. There are 3 stories to Gundurata, but in order for that to be the case, you have to first construct a tiny 3-tiered iron platform for somebody's house. It's interesting to see how seeds planted in the past will evolve with 100 years of iteration. Houses branching off the dock in Venetia will one day become the ocean base of Luna Laboratories. There's a cause and effect at work that provides a sense of weight and responsibility to your work in the Georama, and that's a welcome change. Sometimes a little experimentation is also necessary in figuring out how to complete a requirement. Unlocking new Georama goals requires geostones. Moving through certain areas of the dungeon often requires the input of people or items from the future. This means that the Georama and the dungeons are in a symbiotic relationship with each other here, forcing you to swap priorities often. Again, this may be a matter of preference, but I consider this a positive change. The many different elements of the game feel intertwined. In Dark Cloud, the mechanics often felt sort of disconnected from each other. You could arrive in a new area and finish almost the whole dungeon without having to deal with the Georama, or vice versa. Here, you're frequently asked to take a step back and reassess what's necessary to achieve your current goals. For example, about halfway through the Sindane Forest, you'll be stopped by Master Utan from Dark Cloud 1.
Yeah, it's alright. He's a pretty well-behaved monster. He doesn't hurt people.
It's pitiful, really, but I was awful hungry and somehow got my hands on the forbidden fruit.
Why would you eat the forbidden fruit, you damn dirty ape? It's right there in the name. Forbidden, fool. In this area, you'll find a group of dwarves that have been bewitched by a fish monster that they call the Holy One.
There's a fish called the pristine fish that can clean up all the dirt from my body. So what I'd like you to do is go over there and catch it for me.
I wish I wasn't face to face with this giant, flamboyantly gay, scary fish. So the Holy One needs you to catch a small fish that he'll use to clean himself?
This lovely pristine fish will kiss all the grime off my body and make me look stunning again.
I'm starting to miss the lifeless cutscenes of the first game. Anyway, this section is meant to break up some of the gameplay monotony. It acts as a fishing tutorial since the minigame returns and is quite a bit more extensive. For one thing, you don't have a designated fishing hole anymore. Now, if there's a body of water, you can fish in it. If you're at the beach Georama, you can fish in the ocean. If there's a swamp or some ponds nearby, they'll both have different types of fish swimming around in them. Hell, once you complete a dungeon level, you can even fish in the randomly generated ponds of that area. It's much more modular, much more Majuular, you could say. You wouldn't say that, you would never say that. The downside of this fish are anywhere system is that hooking fish is now strictly a matter of RNG. In Dark Cloud, you can actually see the shadow of the fish underneath the surface and know where to throw your line, kind of that Animal Crossing style. I prefer it. Here you just cast your line and it's only a matter of time before a fish just automatically takes the bait. Everything outside of this is just better. Instead of pressing X at the right time to just catch the fish automatically, you now have to fight for it in an actual mini-game. You have to move your rod to the correct part of the screen while closely monitoring the tension of the line. If you get a little overzealous, the fish will get away. The better the fish, typically the more time and effort you have to put into catching it. When you do catch a fish, you'll earn fishing points. Rather than exchanging these for gems, fishing points can be reinvested into your rod to build up its different attributes. These affect how much tension the line can take, the rarity of the fish you'll find, and how frequently they'll bite, to name a few things. It's basically a fishing RPG within an RPG. Instead of just tossing fish back into the water like the first game, they have different uses. If you buy a grill, you can cook the fish and eat them for health recovery. There's also fishing contests held regularly in town, decided by what day it is. Chronicle, like Cloud, has a day and night cycle, but unlike Cloud, this clock is running at all times. Whether you're in a dungeon, or in a house, or in town, time is always changing and this reflects in your environment. I absolutely love the way Palm Brinks looks at night. It's such a relaxing place to walk around in. See, now I'm getting sidetracked, but hey, this is Dark Chronicle. Getting sidetracked is the name of the game. So depending on how much time has passed, you can enter fishing contests or even participate in fish races, which requires you to build an aquarium and then regularly feed and take care of your fish. Or you can just choose not to engage with any of these systems and sell your fish for some early game pocket change. It's up to you. The fact that they took such a simplistic little part of Cloud and turned it into this multi-dimensional micro game within a game, it's Chronicle to a T. Teeing off. Golfing. There's a golfing minigame now? Yes, a golfing minigame, and again, a weirdly well-developed one. This is Sfida. Once you've unlocked Sfida, every single time you complete almost any level of the dungeon, that floor transforms into a miniature golf course. There are time distortions that appear, that's like the hole, and a Sfida ball will be dropped off somewhere on the same floor. Indeed, this may be the only video game I've ever played with procedurally generated golf courses. You want to hit the ball into the time distortion in order to seal it, thus completing the Sfida challenge on that level. The placement of the ball is randomized. Sometimes it'll be right next to the distortion, sometimes it'll be across the entire level. This placement affects how many hits the ball can take before it disappears, so it's not like you have infinite tries. If you go over the par, so to speak, the game is just over. The thing about Sfida is that simply getting the ball into the time distortion isn't enough to win. The distortion will either be blue or red, and only the opposite colored Sfida ball will seal it. The ball needs to be blue in order to seal a red distortion, and vice versa. To change the ball's color, it needs to make a sufficiently forceful contact with a surface. Ricocheting it into a wall or having it drop onto the ground from above will change its color. With this in mind, you have to calculate how exactly you're going to get the Sfida ball into the distortion while having it be the correct color. Even if the ball is right next to the goal, if they're both blue, you'll have to find a way to change its color before it enters the distortion. It's a pretty simple game, but there's a lot to it. Being able to intuit how height, velocity, friction, and surfaces can be used to reach a goal takes a lot of practice. There are multiple different Sfida clubs which are better for different distances, and they can be upgraded too. When you hit the ball, you can affect its power, trajectory, how much backspin it has on landing. It's straightforward, but the physics powering Sfida are quite technical, and for that reason, you'll need time with the game before you can get good at it. And this is where Sfida runs into a problem. If you don't win a game of Sfida on your first try, you don't get a second one. This means that if you want another attempt on that floor, you'll have to exit the dungeon and go through that level all over again, defeating all of its enemies. You need to repeatedly play in order to understand how the game works, but you're not really given a good chance to do it. The game doesn't tell you where your ball is expected to land or how exactly the environment will affect it, and sometimes it would be nice to know those things.
It doesn't make sense! The physics of it doesn't make sense!
The randomly generated nature of the courses also leads to many glitches and oddities where your ball becomes unreachable by no fault of your own. You're expected to gain skill with these tiny little segments. Before you can even get your sea legs, you've already blown your chance and the game is over. It's like if instead of spending half an hour practicing the guitar, I said, you have to play Hot for Teacher, and then every time you missed a note, I yanked the guitar out of your hands and said, well, you can try again tomorrow. You wouldn't get too far.
Music time's over.
Skill development is a matter of time and repeated failure. So yeah, you'll eventually get the hang of Sfida by like the end of the game. I don't understand why you only get one chance per course, at least give me two. The thing is that I love golf and mini-golf stuff in games, and Sfida has all the ingredients to make me happy. Having to use the dungeon environment, which is not really that well attuned to golfing, is actually a pretty creative spin on the golfing mini-games. You'll land in strange areas and have to make some pretty zany trick shots. It's like JRPG Happy Gilmore. Without allowing you to train though, it's mostly just frustrating and high pressure in an unpleasant way. When all's said and done, Sfida isn't actually all that important to the game at all. The only thing you net from it is a little reward and a medal, which once you have enough can be exchanged for some cosmetic goods. Medals are also earned by completing challenges, which are assigned to different levels of a dungeon. Every level of every dungeon has a list of micro-objectives you can complete, like defeating enemies within a time limit, making it through a level without healing, or finding the exit without switching to another character. This adds a welcome layer of optional challenge and variety to the game. It's nice to have this type of thing keeping each floor feeling fresh, especially if you're diving back into an already beaten dungeon for some grinding. The dungeons themselves are a step up over Dark Cloud. There's simply more personality packed into them for one thing, and this is accomplished through a few different means. First of all, there's a lot more variation in terrain and the kinds of rooms you see inside the dungeons. In Dark Cloud, the walls and floors you see when you first enter a dungeon are the walls and floors you're gonna see until that dungeon is over. Here, there are several different kinds of areas within each new dungeon type. The Ocean Cave, for example, will often have half the level taking place indoors, while the other half takes you outdoors along the beach. There's a stronger focus on exterior environments, which means you can also appreciate how the mood changes as day turns to night and vice versa. Something about the forest just hits different at nighttime, you know? The number and types of cells you'll see in each dungeon also far outpace Dark Cloud. There are more types of rooms, and just more rooms, period. As you reach the end of a dungeon, each level becomes much more expansive, sometimes with multiple routes. In these cases, you can choose a pathway at the end of a level, although it's typically necessary to explore all paths sooner or later. The problem with dungeons in the original game is a problem with dungeons here. They're procedurally generated. This means that there's an upper limit on how unique or engaging each dungeon can actually be on its own. Aesthetics continue to heavily shoulder these dungeons, because mechanically, once you've played through one dungeon, you're not in for many more surprises. This game also doesn't feature back floors anymore. There's only the odd optional section within each floor, with more enemies and loot inside of it. That's about as complex as exploration gets here, and this is just always going to be a fundamental problem with procedural generation in dungeons. You can't handcraft environments or puzzles or any kind of unique experiences for the player. You can only slot together prefabs which narrowly follow the logic of the game's programming. This means that any kind of break in the monotony of dungeon crawling is important. Svita is great because it gives you an excuse to do something other than kill enemies and look for keys. Forcing you to move back to the Georama periodically is appreciated because it's like a mandatory coffee break. Mainly, what saves dungeon crawling from laboriousness is the game's combat. Because the combat is better in Chronicle, it just feels better to move through floors of a dungeon. I'd briefly touched on the combat before, but it's worth going over some further changes. The original game uses canned animations and very simplistic sets of enemy behaviors, which makes combat feel stiff. In Chronicle, there's so much more elasticity to the movements and animations. Hitting enemies can cause them to bounce around from impact, and you really feel a sense of physical force and momentum when you're moving around and fighting. You're not nearly as reliant on cheap tricks like stun-locking enemies or using power attacks to become invincible. From the way that movement is calculated to the way enemies' velocity is halted, the gameplay just makes more sense. You can pick up objects in the environment like rocks or chests and chuck them at enemies to stun them. Hell, you can even pick up enemies to throw at other enemies, which is just endlessly satisfying.
Please! I beg you! You're a genuine dick!
Enemies and their behaviors are much more varied. Each enemy has a rage meter which ticks down as they take damage. If you fail to kill an enemy before the meter is drained, that enemy will enter rage mode. This makes them harder to stagger and their attacks more damaging. It's always good to go in with a plan of action so you can dispatch the enemy as quickly as possible. Guarding is also much more important here, since enemies are less likely to be interrupted from your attacks. It took me a little while to get used to since I'd so rarely guarded in the original game, but it's necessary here to mitigate or avoid damage altogether. As mentioned before, the controls do sometimes feel a bit sticky in combat. Jump attacks are performed by tilting the stick towards an enemy and hitting the attack button. When they do land, it feels good to use, especially when it's a killing blow, but it frequently just doesn't work right. And even after dozens upon dozens of hours with Dark Chronicle, I can't really zero in on why that is. Attack combos occasionally seem to have a mind of their own. You'll hit the button as usual, but it won't work in exactly the same way. In this sense, the same looseness that makes Chronicle's combat more freeform and natural than Cloud's can also make fights feel unfair and unpredictable. Outside of control issues, the difficulty is pretty well tuned, and this is largely thanks to how Dark Chronicle handles its weapon upgrade system. Like pretty much everything else, your options have been expanded to an intimidating degree. Now, instead of slotting components into weapons, you have to use the Spectrumize command. Spectrumizing takes an object in your inventory and turns it into its elemental components, basically making it into the upgrade material. So for example, a firestone is worth 3 points of fire. You spectrumize it, then attach its essence to a weapon, thus increasing that weapon's fire score by 3. Are you following me so far? There won't be a test, you don't need to know this, but if you're interested in a simulation of how I've gradually been losing my mind playing these games, you may want to keep up. Attaching the spectrumized material costs a certain number of synthesis points. Synthesis points are only gained by leveling a weapon up. To level a weapon up, you have to collect the experience orbs of a fallen enemy while wielding that weapon. But sometimes simply wielding the weapon isn't enough. If you kill an enemy with your gun, only your gun will gain experience, so you actually have to use the weapon you want to level up. But actually, you don't. If you kill an enemy as Max or Monica and then quickly switch to the other character, that character will then absorb the experience orbs as if they had killed the monster. Once your weapon has enough synthesis points, you can attach spectrumized materials to that weapon, but unlike Dark Cloud, you're not limited to gems and stones for upgrades. You can spectrumize everything. You can spectrumize healing items, you can spectrumize crafting materials, you can spectrumize other weapons that you've upgraded. They all have their own elemental values, and while it's not as efficient to use random consumables for this purpose as it is to use gems and stones, you still can, you can still do it. Once you've synthesized and spectrumized enough elements to the appropriate specification, you can upgrade your weapons. Monica uses swords, which are faster and more fluid, while Max uses hammers and wrenches, which are slow but hit harder. Unlike the original game, the upgrade tree here is completely ridiculous. You basically need to hunt down a third-party weapon development flowchart to make sure you're not screwing yourself from the outset. I mean, you don't want to spend all this time upgrading just to end up with the Muramasa, do you?
Somebody sure is a weak move.
No, trust me, you want the Island King. It's got a fun spinny thing attached to it, and it takes 8,000 hours to get it. Fuck the Chronicle too. Together we can rule as Island Kings. Of course, you also don't want to neglect your sidearms, or else you'll end up like me, trying to take on the hardest bosses with dinky little pea shooters that hardly do any damage. In order to upgrade to higher level weapons on a particular branch of the tree, you'll have to defeat several predetermined enemy types. These are usually found in some of the endgame dungeons, so you have to hold off a while on getting that sweet Island King. I can see some people being annoyed with this limitation, but I think this is a good change. In this way, the game avoids the pitfalls of Dark Cloud's system, where once you build up your weapons early, there's no reason to engage with most of the rest of the game, to the point of boredom. In Chronicle, you're given a hard limit on those weapon upgrades, but you can still continue to level up and synthesize more stats for your weapons, so it doesn't feel like a sunk cost. It's a good compromise for both types of players, those who are obsessed with min-maxing, and those who just want to take on the game at a leisurely pace. Now, I feel like I'm forgetting something here. Oh right, the robot. Max can build a super fighting robot known as the Ride Pod that can be upgraded with different parts throughout the game. You can build different body types, you can attach different weapons, you can set its transport method to wheels or a propeller or like a jet hover thing. You can upgrade its defenses by building its experience pools and then spending them at Cedric's shop to tune it. Then you can start using it everywhere. You can pull it out in the middle of a dungeon and start cleaning house with this thing as long as you have enough fuel. Some bigger enemies in the dungeon are brutally difficult without the Ride Pod, so you're very much intended to be keeping up with it. In doing so, though, you can make it completely overpowered and just trivialize many of the game's bosses, making them look like utter fools as they chase you in circles, fruitlessly trying to dismantle the mechanized harbinger of their doom. It's beautiful in a way. For some reason, the developers have constructed a game-wide glass ceiling directly over Monica's head because she can't even use the super cool fighting mecha. Instead, she has monster transformations, which suck ass. If you purchase a very expensive badge and load up a capsule with the right treats, you can lure a monster and capture its essence. This allows you to transform into them in dungeons. The thing is, monsters blow, and it takes so much grinding to make them even viable in dungeons. You can use them to have conversations with other monsters inside of dungeons, which I guess is kinda cute, but otherwise it's a big waste of time. I suppose the fact that it even exists is impressive. How much stuff can they pack into this damn game? That's a question with seemingly no limit on its answer, at least for much of the game. When you start a new game, Dark Chronicle does a reasonably good job of trickling in new ideas and concepts for you to wrap your head around before introducing others. By the midpoint of the game, you are drowning in things to do. Dungeon crawling, time traveling, base building, weapon upgrading, photography, inventing, fishing contests, scoop gathering, mini golfing, citizen recruiting, robot building, monster catching, metal gathering. This is a nightmare scenario for someone with ADHD. The number of, oh, what about that thing over there is so astonishingly sidetracking that I frequently forgot what I was even doing in the first place. You'll leave the Georama to go buy some logs for your house, close your eyes, and somehow you'll have ended up in the invention menu building clown shit for your robot. Some developers take an essentialist approach to game design. Nothing that doesn't belong in the game finds its way in. Every aspect of the gameplay is carefully pruned so as to exist in perfect harmony with all of its associated elements. Like a finely hued sandalwood chair, such a game has no need for frills. It's all signal and no noise, exposing its very core to be appreciated for what it is, rather than lamented for what it is not. Dark Chronicle is the opposite of this. It is RPG maximalism, a never-ending feast of mechanics that are introduced at an overwhelming pace. With each passing hour of this game, the list of its systems and all of the ways that they interact with each other grows. It grows far beyond any reasonable expectation of the rules and procedures you might expect in an RPG. And it is equal parts exhausting and glorious. If you're a fan of systems-driven gameplay, this game is going to give you more than you ever could have hoped for. I don't think I've ever seen such a multi-dimensional array of just shit to mess around with. This game is like 5 games worth of game, and against all of the odds, all 5 of those games are pretty well developed and enjoyable in their own right. Aside from a few exceptions, such as Monica's monster transformations, at no point did I think to myself, boy, they wasted a lot of energy with this mechanic, or this segment of the game feels half-baked. Those thoughts never popped into my head. For such a massive game to be so well realized feels like the result of a meeting with the devil at a crossroads or something. What was going on, Mr. Hino? And I reiterate, this game was made less than 2 years after Dark Cloud. This is Level 5's sophomore game. To have learned and applied so much knowledge from a single project is superhuman. It's almost kind of annoying. This game is just a big show-off. When I decided to play these games back to back, I did not realize what I was going to be in for. One point of contention over this game is the art style. It's notably more childish than its predecessor, for lack of a better term. Level 5 opted to use cel-shaded graphics, or something more or less analogous to them. They call it tonal rendering, which is similar to cel shading but less outwardly cartoony, a la Wind Waker. This style gives the game a light and approachable aesthetic somewhere between an anime and a nicely illustrated picture book. I do understand the feelings of anyone who preferred the original. That game strove for a shonen anime style, geared less towards children and more towards teenagers. It was a little grittier and more realistic, which I'd imagine is at least partially owed to Level 5's inexperience with the PS2 at the time. Those kinds of more realistic textures and less stylized world designs are an obvious pick for a new studio, and it does have a certain raw quality to it. Early PS2 games just have a different vibe than those made later in the console's life. I have to assume this is all partially why, despite playing through the original so many times, my buddy just never had an interest in Dark Chronicle. The similarities between these two games are broader and more conceptual than you might think. They don't feel the same, and they certainly don't look the same. This just isn't his Dark Cloud. It doesn't capture his nostalgia, and I can appreciate that. Dark Chronicle's texture work is much cleaner, less gritty, with a painterly quality to its landscapes and backgrounds. I mean, you can literally see the brush strokes in the grass. The general level of detail is higher too, both in terms of raw polygon counts on the models, as well as the unique clothing and expressions worn by the NPCs of this world. The character designs were already quite good in Dark Cloud, and I feel like Chronicle has only managed to improve on this. There are many fantastical creatures and oddball NPCs whose dispositions are nicely communicated through their visual designs. This whole game is a crash course on how to breathe personality into an RPG. At the risk of repeating myself, the many environmental details here were such an ambitious touch too. Every zone feels different and the moods communicated through its architecture, color, and clutter. The animation work is certainly higher fidelity than Dark Cloud, but that also makes its inadequacies more noticeable. The cutscenes are well directed for the most part, but sometimes the characters' movements and facial expressions feel pretty stiff and awkward. This is also owing to the fact that Chronicle is such a long game with so many different story scenes. Level 5 definitely had their work cut out for them. You obviously have the through line of finding Emperor Griffin and thwarting his evil plan, but each segment has its own little fairy tale plot going on. In Sindain, Max and Monica find a group of dwarves living together. They ask our protagonist to find a woman named Holly who they once lived with. They care deeply for Holly, but one day she up and left, never to return. Upon defeating the boss of Sindain, you find that Holly is a magical butterfly who takes on human form sometimes. The dwarves had freed her from a spider web, so she approached them in gratitude and found that she actually kinda dug these funny little guys. But in the end, they had to part ways. Kind of a spin on Snow White, cute enough for what it is. Most of the individual stories you'll partake in here involve some variation on classic fables with new twists. If you're in the RPG game for compelling and believable characters, multi-layered stories with deep themes and shocking turns, Dark Chronicle is not going to do anything for you. The stories it has to tell are mostly collections of recognizable cliches modernized for a PS2-owning audience. They're charming enough, and I could see a particularly young audience getting a kick out of some of the stuff here. I find the game's plot and the way it's told really lacks the teeth of Level 5's other games. Take Professor Layton. Those games also feature simple and digestible plots, heavily reliant on familiar tropes and archetypes, but they often feel clever and surprising. Dark Chronicle, even when it's presenting what amounts to a twist, never feels like it's unfolding in a gratifying way. Instead, the plot lines within the game are disconnected enough to never feel all that consequential. Most of the characters introduced are featured only briefly relative to the game's length, so it's difficult to continually become invested in this revolving door of cast members' plights. Nothing is really taken seriously or treated with that much respect. Monica's father dying is seldom brought up, and it doesn't seem to affect her one way or the other. She just kind of bounces back. As a result, her whole arc feels non-existent. It's like she's not really learning or absorbing anything that's happening. And that's one of the main characters. The side characters fare even worse, and I'm just never sold on the fact that they're facing real problems or dealing with repercussions. When the game does take a crack at more traditional JRPG storytelling, it comes across as contrived, to put it nicely. There's a character named Gaspard. As the right-hand man of Emperor Griffin, he's presented as our primary rival throughout the game. After seeing him only a handful of times and mopping the floor with him each and every time, he delivers this bizarre, unearned monologue.
You're chasing after my mother. You'll hurt her if I don't stop you.
Your mother? You fight to protect your mother.
I mean, yeah, wouldn't that be a good reason to fight?
I had a mother too, just like everyone else.
I mean, sure, I don't doubt it. That's why it's weird that you think protecting your mother is stupid.
I just wanted to protect my mother too, just like you two.
Okay, well, why'd you say it was stupid then? Why are you shouting at me? I don't even understand what's happening. And then after very little by way of characterization, he dramatically reveals his villain backstory about how his father died, he and his mother were discriminated against, and then she died. His rivalry with Max and Monica is entirely predicated on this burning hatred he's had for humans his entire life. Then for no real reason, and I'm not kidding, Max and Monica don't convince him or talk him down or really say anything at all. He just decides that he's been living his life all wrong and then redeems himself and then dies dramatically. I'm just sitting here during this entire speech like, who's this guy again? Why is he being good now? The concept of a character who's driven to evil as retaliation for misdeeds done against them is a setup as old as the hills, and it's a classic for a reason. It's a strong motive, and revenge, as messy and purposeless as it often is a relatable sentiment for most of us. When we're wronged, we want our perception of justice to be served. But in order for this scene to act as payoff, it needed to be set up, and it just never was. We only know Gaspard for the vast majority of the game as the assassin of Monica's father. That makes him basically irredeemable to begin with. It's not like he himself helped Griffin to kill Monica's father. No, it was him. He pulled the trigger, so to speak. He ended a man's life and irrevocably ruined many lives around that. The game wants to give Gaspard room for redemption, yet we're never given a sense for what kind of man he is, what drives him, or if he feels remorse in any way. He just up and decides to tell his sob story and then becomes a good guy right before dying. It's pretty ham-fisted and indicative of Dark Chronicle's struggle to create stakes. Don't get me wrong, Dark Cloud wasn't exactly packed with emotional weight, but its yarn only really unfurled toward the ass end of the game, and it did a decent job of keeping everything cogent under those circumstances. Dark Chronicle is actively trying to pull you into its world, invest you in its characters, and while all of the ideas are there, it just doesn't know what to do with them. Moreover, the time-traveling elements don't value add to this story. I don't mind the time travel when it's a simple matter of cause and effect. We need to create the past to repair the future. A society grows great when old men plant trees that will one day become shopping malls that they themselves can never visit. I think it goes something like that. Once they start incorporating those elements into the plot, it becomes muddled. The game simultaneously wants to be a lighthearted fairy tale storybook and a melodramatic time-traveling JRPG. I couldn't tell you why exactly, but Chrono Trigger just seems to be in a league of its own when it comes to telling clean, compelling stories about time travel. Dark Chronicle incorporates time-traveling mobile fortresses, time-traveling trains, time-space breaks that we have to perform to drag things back and forth through time. Max gets to meet his mother after talking about how much he misses her for the whole game and having all these flashbacks to his childhood. But instead of it feeling like a sincere moment of payoff, it's just used as a springboard to coldly deliver 10 minutes of expository dialogue. Griffin as a villain fares a little better than Gaspard. He's a moon bunny person, which is actually kind of a fun bait and switch. He's also the wielder of the third and most powerful of the 3 Atlamilia crystals. He desires Max and Monica's Atlamilias because only by wielding all 3 can he exercise all-encompassing control over the world and space-time. His plan? To call forth the Oblivion Star and destroy all life as we know it. Like Gaspard, he's driven by a hatred of humanity, having lost a loved one named Alexandra a long time ago. And I'm sorry to say this, but he's a bunny person, how can I be afraid? I mean, at least Osmond had the good sense to put goggles and a funny hat on, he just owned it. But Griffin, brother, you're a bunny rabbit.
I got them! This is what I wanted!
A bunny rabbit voiced by Phil and Lil DeVille.
Now then, why don't we get started? It's time to purify this world.
Alright, see, now you're Satan, voiced by Mark Hamill. This is very scary for me. Excellent development here.
Let's fuck this shit up!
While all of this is unfurling, you stay dungeon crawling, and the dungeon crawling intensifies, in fact. Dungeons get longer, enemies get tougher, and their behaviors become more advanced. Boss fights, actually those are pretty easy, kind of a fun evolution from the original game, so I can't complain about them for the most part. Regardless, the more pressure the story places on you to reach the ending, the more the game dangles those boo-boo keys just out of your reach. You'll finally finish up a nice long section only to find out that you now have to travel to each dungeon you've already completed, but this time head down an alternate path and fight alternate bosses. I cannot think of a game that needs padding less than this one, and yet, here we are. And that's really the issue here. Despite all of the new additions, and there have been so many, you're still just going through procedurally generated dungeons for like 80% of this very long game. The presentation is pleasant, the music is quite nice, and the combat is fun, but doing the same things over and over again feels like work ultimately. Dark Cloud, strangely enough, actually kind of had an advantage here. The game was not at all shy about its grind. You set yourself up with a few clear, self-imposed objectives, clock in for a shift. Dark Chronicle sort of dresses itself up a bit. It muddles the reality of its gameplay loop with decadent layers of sweet icing, and that icing tastes good, but eventually you start thinking to yourself, okay, enough with the food analogies please, I'd like to get to the core of the experience here. By the time you get there, you're kind of filled up on icing, now there's still an entire game of dungeon crawling you gotta cruise through. Dark Cloud looks you in the eye and straight up says, yeah, you're gonna do the same thing over and over again, and it's gonna be pretty simple, so get to it, bitch. And you say, yes sir, thank you sir. And in a strange way, that total simplicity and complete lack of frills makes the grind more tolerable. It's more honest, it drip feeds you some sense of purpose. The grind in Dark Chronicle feels like a bit more of a toil. You're given so many opportunities to take breaks and pursue other activities. It's like having a staff room full of beanbag chairs and espresso machines and nap pods and shit. It's like That's cool, man. I appreciate you making the experience easier on me, but I would actually genuinely like to get some work done at some point while I am an employee here. So you commit to it. You wander the same halls, fighting the same enemies, and absorbing the experience orbs, and they make their satisfying little blobby orb noises, and the bars go up, and it triggers the same kind of psychological reaction as winning $2 at a slot machine, but it becomes fatiguing. It's at this point where you start thinking, maybe I should drop the game for a while, but man, you can't do that. You're like 55 hours into this game. You need to ask yourself, if I drop this game now and play something else for a while, am I really, truly going to pick it back up again? The answer for you might be yes. We don't share a brain after all, but I know myself. I know if I don't commit to this and fight through the doldrums, this game may very well remain unbeaten for years to come, if not forevermore. At long last, we reach the final area. Much like Dark Cloud, the goal of the Georama in this final area isn't to build our own little town, but to reconstruct memories to understand Griffin a little better. I consider this a bonus, since it removes the pressure of having to do a whole other Georama segment in this last stretch. The dungeon is long, the enemies are tough, but at last we reach the end. But first, how about some Svita? We've waited this long to deal with Griffin. Damn, what a shot. Okay, we can deal with Griffin now. As final bosses go, this one is quite a bit better than Dark Cloud. The combat system is more accommodating for this kind of epic one-on-one duel. There's not as much poppycock going on here as the Dark Genie fight. It's still a little messy, but it's not bad. We learn that much like Seda in Dark Cloud, Griffin, or Cirrus, as is revealed to be his true name, isn't entirely to blame for the circumstances. His hatred birthed an entity called the Dark Element, which seized Cirrus's mind and led him down a dark path. This being of pure evil leaves his body and heads into the zany space dimension. I was hoping there'd be one of those before the game was over. Here we're given the pleasure of very slowly walking up some winding ramps and fighting a boss rush, which mainly consists of harder versions of enemies we've already fought. And again, I must simply ask, why? Why can't we just fight the Dark Element? The scenery is cool, but I only need like a minute or two to absorb it, not a whole extra section of the game. These bosses are so lame. I don't understand why the final section of the game is prolonged to this degree. Finally, we come face to face with the Dark Element. This boss fight is timed, giving you only 5 minutes to complete it. Its patterns aren't very difficult to recognize, but it can only be damaged by one of your characters, depending on what its current color is. This is sort of a pain in the ass for me, because I'm colorblind. Couldn't help but notice that there hasn't been a save point in a really long time. Kinda hope there's been like an autosave or something. Oh, shit. Nothing like fighting all 3 phases of Griffin again. Nothing like fighting all of the boss rush guys again. Nothing like climbing the spiral slope again. Oh, mama. What began with the defeat of the Dark Elephant ends with the defeat of the Dark Element. Dark Chronicle is finally over. Cirrus realizes the error of his ways. Max's mother, Monica, and many of the friends he's met along the way must return to their own time period, as they can't exist in both times at once. Max resolves to write a letter that'll reach his mother someday, which explains Max's inner monologue throughout the game. He's been writing his letter bit by bit, explaining everything that's happened along the way. Max returns to his simple life with a grand adventure under his belt, and Monica, I guess, despite being co-protagonist, just wasn't really important enough to have any kind of real finale, but she got a big empty mansion to enjoy now, so that was Dark Chronicle, and as much fun as I've had, I'm glad it's over. Wait, why can't I load up my post-game save?
I've decided I'm going to revitalize the whole area. And the first step is to expand the Blackstone Railroad to cover all of it. What do you reckon, Max? Will you help?
No.
Yeah, of course. I want you to go to the mine and search out some Zelmite, which we need for fuel.
We need fuel? The Forgotten Adventure?
Once more into the fray. Into the last good fight I'll ever know.
So yeah, there's a bonus chapter. In the great tradition of the Demon Shaft, there's a difficult optional dungeon tucked into a mine shaft in Palm Brinks. I'm not doing it, okay? I've had enough. Bunch of fucking bullshit. Everything here kills me instantly because apparently there was a bunch of power-ups available at the end of the game, but they're all missable, and damn it, I'm not doing that last boss again. Oh, Monica is back. There goes the emotional send-off, but I won't look a gift Monica in the mouth. This dungeon is long, like really long. The trick is to get inside of your super fighting robot and just never look back. It's not the most efficient way of making it through the mines, but it is the safest. See an enemy? Oh, no you don't. I am thankful that they brought this biomechanical nightmare version of Flotsam back into the game. We just killed a man, Monica, and there's nothing funny about that. Thankfully, the mines, as extensive as they are nowhere near as long as the demon shaft. There's something about that sentence. Although they present a much more legitimate challenge down to the final boss of the area. It's the Dark Genie again. Well, actually, no, it's the mouse that was the fake Dark Genie that we completely erased from this plane of existence with the alien robot thing. Oh well. The Dark Genie floats around the arena, occasionally firing devastating attacks at you while an army of very small, infinitely respawning genies tries to crowd you and stop you from attacking him. He switches back and forth just like the Dark Element, sometimes only being vulnerable to Max's attacks and other times Monica's. The issue I had is that he completely glitched out no less than 2 times, and I wasn't able to deliver the final itty-bitty amount of damage it would have taken to finish him off. Inexplicably, after my 3rd try, he did fall, and by that point, I was seeing red. I'm tired, bro. There you have it, Dark Chronicle, and it's really over this time, no hidden Chapter 9. Despite an exhausting final few chapters for me, and in the case of the bonus chapter, that exhaustion was self-inflicted, let's be fair, Dark Chronicle is probably one of the great action RPGs. Yes, just like Dark Cloud, it has its problems, its own unique problems, partially incurred due to its insatiable appetite for more bullet points. For a game with such a child-friendly aesthetic, it can be pretty intimidating to play. There's so much going on here. By the time every mechanic, minigame, and side activity is introduced, you actually need a reintroduction to the original few you were introduced to in the first place. Even an exhaustive list of in-game tutorials can't solve the problem. Underneath it all is a dungeon crawling loop that, despite its improvements, can't quite disguise its own inevitable tedium. That said, this game still shines in many ways. What Dark Cloud 2 captures better than any individual thing is the breadth of adventure you feel as a child. You're given so many opportunities to marinate in this game world for as long as you could ever want to. The story may be childish at some points and contrived at others, but still, it's hard not to crack a smile when Max sees the ocean for the first time or marvels at the night sky after leaving Palm Brinks. If you're a parent or you've ever babysat, you know what it's like to deal with an excited kid. They grab you by the hand, showing you everything they've ever cared about, souvenirs they got on a road trip, their favorite video game, their seashell collection, a rock they found in the backyard that looks vaguely like a dinosaur tooth, I guess. It's a mile a minute. Everything is beautiful, everything is amazing, everything is worthy of your attention. That secondhand excitement is palpable, but it can also be exhausting. As an adult with a personality and thought patterns that have more or less crystallized with age, it's hard to keep track of such a stream of consciousness, and this is the case with Dark Chronicle. It's got a lot to say, and it's not always very good at pacing itself, but if you go into it with a willingness to engage with its pillowcase full of Halloween candy, you may find some kind of temporary connection to your inner child, where things were cool and fun, and that was enough. I'm glad to have experienced it, but I gotta admit, I'm glad it's over. It's because I'm an adult, and despite how much fun Sfida is, and how satisfying it is to land a big fish, I need to do my taxes, I need to snowblow my driveway, I need to run some errands tomorrow, so if you still have the receipt for those duvet covers, I can return them for you. See? Look at this, look how boring I am. It's been a slice, Dark Chronicle, but your eternal youth is a bit much for this haggard old man. Now if you'll excuse me, I need a power nap. Huh? What? Oh, right. Dark Cloud. You know, despite technically belonging to the same series, both of these games take a very different approach to enticing the player. One operates like a simple, well-oiled machine, turning repetition into a game of its own. See, isn't working at the cheese sandwich factory assembly line fun? Well, no, not really, and yet I can't seem to stop. The other game bombards you with novelty, packing your mouth with so much ice cream that you become the envy of every Jerry and Jane on the block. Then you have to save room for vegetables, that being the dungeon crawl. The food analogies really need to come to a complete halt here. The point is that despite sharing so many similarities by way of the basic gameplay loop, these games are philosophically at odds in many ways. This makes for a bit of a divide, where some people swear by the original and others insist that the sequel is an improvement in every way. For my money, Dark Chronicle is a bloody achievement, and I only wish I could have had my hands on it as a youngster. This is the kind of game that would have given me endless hours of entertainment. For Tristan, it was Dark Cloud, and it makes sense given what I know of him. He's a mechanical man with linear thought processes. I'm more of an abstract, funkish forest type of guy, to each their own. Regardless of where you stand, these games clearly resonated with people. Dark Chronicle really caught fire in Japan, selling over 200,000 copies in its first year. It's a far cry from the dull thud that was Dark Cloud over there. Rumors have swirled for years about a possible follow-up to Dark Chronicle. It's no wonder Level 5 went so far as to tease a potential third entry in the game's official art book. Of course, this third game never materialized. Much of Dark Cloud's design and the fans' enthusiasm towards the series was parlayed into what would become Level 5's Rogue Galaxy. Even today, I'm struck by how lively the fanbase for the Dark Cloud series is. There's still plenty of discussion, data mining, fan projects, and sick-ass Spheta shots being shared after all these years. No, oh, you bastard. These games are cult hits for a reason. They're somehow greater than the sum of their parts. I mean, the proof is in the pudding. Level 5's third game was Dragon Quest VIII, a game that is generally considered to be one of the greatest RPGs ever made. You know what my third video was? It was a silent long play of the game Radical Dreamers. I don't know what was in the water over in Level 5 HQ, but those wizards had it on lock. The company went on to build a storied legacy, taking those lessons learned from their early games and applying them to new ventures. The unmatched levels of charm they're able to convey through their game worlds remains a touchstone of their work even to this day. It's too bad that their bread and butter is licensed games these days. They've got so much to offer this world. Well, their story isn't over just yet, and who knows, maybe Dark Clouds isn't either. Ooh, every time I suggest the possibility of a sequel in my videos, it doesn't happen. Sorry to curse the franchise, Dark Cloud fans. Tristan, thanks for bugging me about Dark Cloud since we were young and dumb. I'm glad to have experienced it now that I'm old and dumb.